Will to live. If you honestly question your life, one thing becomes very clear. Most of it is filled with suffering, with only small moments of happiness. And yet, despite all the endless pain, you continue to live on, driven by something deeper than logic, the unstoppable will to live. For Arthur Schopenhauer, this will was the basic force behind all existence. In his book, The World as Will and Representation, he described it as a blind and relentless drive that pushes every living being to survive, reproduce, and keep going. It is not rational, conscious, or purposeful. It simply exists. Schopenhauer wrote that life belongs to the will to live, and so it clings to it even under the most miserable conditions. But the will is not a source of joy. Instead, it is the root of suffering, because whenever you satisfy one desire, another immediately takes its place. And when you escape one pain, a new one soon emerges. Schopenhauer argued that pleasure is short-lived while suffering is constant. He said that all satisfaction is only negative, meaning it is just the removal of a desire and of pain. This endless struggle is universal in nature, because life devours life in a cycle of survival. In human existence, ambition often leads to emptiness. And unlike animals, we are able to reflect on our suffering. Yet we remain trapped by the will, which only increases our misery. Hell is other people. Hell is not a place where you go, it is the people you are with. Jean-Paul Sartre's idea that hell is other people shows a deep truth about human relationships. For Sartre, the real torment lies in being trapped under the gaze of others. Human existence is shaped by how we are seen and judged, forcing us to see ourselves through their eyes instead of how we truly are. Imagine standing in front of a distorted mirror at a funhouse that warps your reflection. No matter how much you try to adjust or explain what you really look like, the reflection still defines you in the eyes of everyone watching. Sartre argued that this is what it feels like to exist around others. Every glance, every judgment imposes a version of you that might not match your real self. This experience is not just a small discomfort, it is a basic part of being human. The need for validation keeps us in a cycle where we crave recognition even though it limits our true authenticity. Sartre believed that the gaze of others turns us into objects, and it takes away our freedom to define ourselves independently. Even the best human relationships carry this hidden tension, because the very presence of others creates an invisible net of expectations and judgments that traps us into roles we never fully choose. For Sartre, this endless conflict defines the human condition, a constant pull between wanting to be seen and the unavoidable loss of freedom that comes with it. Sadian nihilism. Nature does not care if you are good or evil, just or cruel. This is the harsh foundation of Sadian nihilism, a philosophy taken from the provocative writings of the Marquis de Sade, whose ideas questioned the very foundation of morality itself. At its core, Sadian nihilism rejects the belief in universal moral truths. De Sade argued that ideas like virtue and justice are only human inventions forced onto an indifferent and amoral natural world. In his novel Justine, he writes that nature has created us only to torment one another. For de Sade, nature is only about survival and desire, without any concern for right or wrong. His view of humanity reflected this harsh truth because he saw people as creatures ruled by raw impulses rather than reason or ethics. If morality is just a human invention, then there is no true obligation to follow its rules. In his work, Philosophy in the Bedroom, he wrote that real freedom means embracing natural desires, no matter how transgressive or destructive they may be. Dysteleological suffering. The universe we observe has exactly the qualities we would expect if, at the deepest level, there is no design, no purpose, no good, no evil, only pitiless indifference. This statement by Richard Dawkins explains the heart of dysteleological suffering, the idea that pain exists without meaning, purpose, or redemption. Nature does not care about suffering. Predators hunt prey, parasites thrive, all simply as part of survival, not morality or design. In this view, suffering is not a test or a lesson, it is only a byproduct of the relentless process of life. There is no cosmic plan, no higher reason to explain the pain that fills existence. The word dysteleology combines the Greek word telos, meaning end or purpose, with dys, meaning flawed or wrong. It rejects comforting stories that suffering serves a greater good and instead shows a world ruled by chaos and competition, not by divine order. Abjection. Why does a decaying corpse horrify us so deeply? Why do we recoil from things that blur the lines between human and not human? These reactions come from abjection, a concept described by Julia Kristeva in her book Powers of Horror. Abjection is not just fear or disgust, it is the deep psychological discomfort we feel when something breaks the boundaries that shape our sense of self. Kristeva explained that human identity depends on clear distinctions, such as self and other, life and death, clean and unclean. The object is anything that destroys these boundaries, forcing us to face what we usually repress or push away. Things like blood or vomit disturb us because they blur the line between inside and outside, reminding us of our vulnerability, our physical bodies, and our mortality. A corpse, once alive but now decaying, stands between human and other and directly confronts us with the reality of death, a truth we spend much of life trying to ignore. God is dead. Friedrich Nietzsche's words, "God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him," are some of the most famous and shocking words in philosophy. Written in his 1882 work, The Gay Science, this was not a literal claim, but a serious warning. Nietzsche was not speaking of the actual death of a deity, but of the collapse of the belief systems that had guided Western civilization for centuries. At the center of this idea was the impact of the Enlightenment science and secular thinking. Faith in God was replaced with faith in reason and progress, which freed humanity from religious dogma. But Nietzsche saw this as both a liberation and a danger. The moral framework once provided by religion was now gone, leaving humanity adrift without absolute meaning or values. He illustrated this crisis with his parable of the madman. In the story, a man runs into a marketplace shouting that God is dead and that we're his murderers. The crowd only laughs, not realizing the seriousness of his words. The madman mourns, asking, "What did we do when we cut the earth loose from its sun? Are we not falling endlessly? Is there any real up or down anymore?" Without God, humanity loses its foundation and risks falling into nihilism, the belief that life is meaningless.
Being and nothingness. Existence comes before essence. This is Jean-Paul Sartre's central idea in Being and Nothingness, and it is the heart of his existentialist philosophy. Humans are not born with a fixed nature or purpose. Instead, we create our essence through our actions and our choices. Sartre said we are not defined by what we are, but by what we do. He separated two ways of being in itself and being for itself. Being in itself means objects that simply exist without change or awareness, like a rock or a chair. They cannot reflect or change themselves. Being for itself is human consciousness. Unlike objects, humans are incomplete, always changing and always defining themselves by their ability to reflect, to choose, and to imagine possibilities. A key part of Sartre's philosophy is the idea of nothingness. Consciousness opens a gap of nothingness between ourselves and the world. This gap gives humans the power to imagine what could be and to act freely. But this freedom also brings a heavy burden because it makes us responsible for shaping our lives and humanity through the choices we make. Eternal torment of samsara. Life is suffering, not just in its hardest times, but in its very nature. This is the heart of samsara, the endless cycle of birth, death, and rebirth in Buddhism. Samsara is not only one lifetime or a metaphor for struggle, it is the infinite repetition of existence itself. It is powered by karma, the law of cause and effect, where every action plants a seed that shapes future lives. But even good karma still ties you to samsara, because as long as desire, attachment, and ignorance remain, the cycle continues. What makes samsara truly painful is not only the suffering, but also the illusion that traps us. We chase fleeting happiness, believing it will last, but it always ends in disappointment. Even life's joys, love, success, and comfort are temporary, slipping away like sand between fingers. The Buddhist philosopher Nagarjuna compared samsara to an endless sea of suffering with waves of birth and death tossing beings around forever. In this sea, all creatures from insects to kings are tied by the same karmic chains. Buddhism teaches that ignorance is the root of this suffering. We mistake what is temporary for eternal. We mistake what is painful for pleasure, and we mistake the self as something real. These false beliefs blind us to the chance of liberation. The escape lies in nirvana, which is not a physical place but a state beyond suffering, beyond desire, and beyond individuality. It is the ultimate freedom. But to reach it, we must let go of attachments and see the world as it truly is, impermanent, interconnected, and empty of any fixed essence.
The shadow. There is a part of you that you refuse to see, a hidden side that you deny or project onto others. Carl Jung called this part the shadow. It is always there, shaping who you are, whether you admit it or not. Jung believed the shadow contains everything you reject about yourself, including your darker impulses, your forbidden desires, and your unacknowledged flaws. But it is not just evil. It is any part of you that does not match the image you want the world to see. The shadow is created when you push these traits down, usually in childhood, in order to meet the expectations of family or society. The strange thing is that the more you suppress the shadow, the more power it gains. Jung warned that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will control your life, and you will call it fate. Your shadow shows itself in subtle ways, like anger projected onto others, envy hidden as criticism, or insecurities driving your choices. Jung described the process of dealing with the shadow as shadow integration. This is not about acting out impulses, but about understanding them. By facing the shadow, you move closer to individuation, which means becoming a whole and authentic self. Suppressed qualities like ambition or creativity can be turned into strengths once they are recognized. Misanthropy. Humanity is often praised as a miracle of evolution, capable of creating art, science, and love. But for the misanthrope, humanity is more like a plague, a species defined by greed, cruelty, and self-destruction. Is this a harsh truth, or only the disappointment of those who see reality too clearly? Misanthropy, which means distrust or hatred of humankind, has been present throughout history. The ancient Greek philosopher Diogenes walked the streets of Athens with a lantern, saying he was searching for an honest man, though he doubted such a person existed. Arthur Schopenhauer took the idea even further, describing humanity as driven by a blind and selfish will that causes endless suffering. Misanthropy is not only about pessimism, it is a criticism of the human condition itself. Misanthropes argue that our capacity for destruction is greater than our virtues. War, environmental collapse, and systemic injustice reveal a species whose intelligence often increases rather than reduces its flaws.
Human sacrifice mythos. Few ideas are as disturbing as human sacrifice, the act of offering a life in order to please the gods, seek divine favor, or restore cosmic balance. What made civilizations across the world accept such rituals, and what does this reveal about the human mind? Human sacrifice existed across cultures and time, from Aztec temples to Celtic druids, and from ancient China to Mesopotamia. At the center of it was the belief that blood was the ultimate currency in the cosmic order. For the Aztecs, it was not only ritual, but also a necessity, because they believed that gods had sacrificed themselves to create the world, and so humanity owed them a debt. Historian David Carrasco wrote that, without the nourishment of blood, the sun would fail to rise, and so sacrifice kept the universe alive. But why humans instead of animals or crops? Because human life was seen as sacred and priceless, the ultimate offering with spiritual weight. Philosopher René Girard studied the psychology of sacrifice and suggested it came about as a way to solve social conflict. His scapegoat theory explained that societies placed their collective guilt or fear onto a single victim to restore unity. Sacrifice was not only spiritual, it was political, because priests and rulers claimed power through their supposed ability to connect humanity with the divine. Over time, sacrifice changed. Ritual bloodshed was replaced with moral sacrifices like self-denial and guilt in systems such as Christianity. Today, human sacrifice is gone, but its echoes survive in our stories and in the idea of sacrificing for greater causes. Death drive. Why do people ruin themselves? Why do we sometimes choose chaos instead of order and destruction instead of survival? Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis, believed he had an answer to the death drive. Deep inside our unconscious mind, there exists a dark and primal force, not pulling us toward life, but toward self-destruction and a return to nothingness. In his 1920 book, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud introduced this idea of the death drive, or thanatos. Until then, Freud had focused on the pleasure principle, the idea that humans seek pleasure and avoid pain. But he noticed something strange. Not all behavior followed this rule. People often sabotage themselves, repeat harmful patterns, and are drawn to suffering. Freud argued that alongside our drive to live, there is also an opposite force that pulls us toward destruction. At its core, the death drive reflects a wish to return to a state of non-existence, a kind of stillness that existed before life began. Freud described it as an urge in all living things to return to an earlier state. It shows itself in decay, in risky behaviors, and in the self-destructive patterns that affect both individuals and societies.
Nihilism. Life has no built-in meaning and no ultimate purpose written into the universe. This is the claim of nihilism, a philosophy that takes away assumptions and forces us to face life without illusions. It does not reject life, but instead challenges us to see it as it really is, raw and without filters. At its center, nihilism argues that the systems we trust, morality, religion, and even identity, are only human inventions. The values and beliefs that once gave life meaning are actually without foundation, leaving a void where certainty used to be. When these frameworks collapse, we are left to question the worth of our goals and values. If there is no ultimate truth or purpose, what can justify any of our actions? Some people see nihilism as a chance for deep freedom, because with no preordained purpose, individuals are free to build their own values and meanings. From this view, nihilism is not despair, but a foundation for empowerment and self-creation. However, others see nihilism as a fall into chaos and despair, because without higher authority or objective meaning, life risks becoming nothing more than random actions where morality feels arbitrary and existence feels empty. Radical skepticism. How can you be certain the world around you is real? What if everything, your thoughts, your memories, and even your sense of self, is nothing more than an illusion? This disturbing idea lies at the heart of radical skepticism, a philosophy that asks, how do you truly know anything at all? Radical skepticism questions the very base of certainty. René Descartes, the 17th century philosopher, faced this directly. He doubted everything, his senses, the world, and even his own body. He wrote that he would suppose that some evil demon used its all-power to deceive him. Even the simplest truths, like the existence of the world outside his mind, could be doubted. In this search for certainty, Descartes found one truth that could not be doubted: cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. The very act of doubting proved that he existed as a thinking being. Yet this was a lonely kind of certainty, because everything beyond his own thoughts was still uncertain. David Hume carried skepticism even further. He argued that the mind is only a bundle of passing perceptions tied together by habit, not by logic.
He even questioned causality itself, asking how do we truly know that one event causes another? For Hume, our ideas about the world, such as the sun rising tomorrow, are only based on habit and probability, not on guarantees. Radical skepticism is not only for philosophy books. Every time you misremember something or mistake a dream for reality, you are touching its unsettling world. It gives no comfort and no easy answers, only the truth that real certainty is always out of reach. The deeper we look into reality, the more it seems to dissolve. So the next time you feel completely certain about something, pause and question it, because you may find far less certainty than you believed.
The silence of God. The question at the center of the silence of God is a problem that has troubled humanity for centuries. It does not ask whether God exists, but rather why, if he does, he appears so absent, especially in moments of suffering and doubt. The Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard struggled with this silence, seeing it not as absence but as a test of faith. He described faith as the contradiction between the infinite passion of inner belief and the objective uncertainty of God's presence. For Kierkegaard, this silence demanded a leap into the unknown, a trust in God without clear or tangible proof. For thinkers like Simone Weil, the silence of God becomes even more paradoxical when connected to suffering. Weil believed that silence was not abandonment, but rather an invitation to find meaning within struggle. She wrote that the greatness of Christianity lies in the fact that it does not search for a supernatural cure for suffering, but rather seeks a supernatural purpose within it. The problem becomes darker with another possibility. What if the silence is not a test or a mystery at all? What if it is just silence? What if there is no divine voice, no presence, no answer at all? Antinatalism. Every birth is a gamble, and the stakes of this gamble are existence itself. Antinatalism, one of philosophy's most unsettling ideas, argues that this gamble is not worth taking. It claims that bringing a child into the world is always an act of harm, no matter how well-intentioned. At the center of modern antinatalism is David Benatar, whose book Better Never to Have Been makes a striking argument. Benatar's reasoning depends on what he calls the asymmetry of pleasure and pain. He suggests that while the presence of pain is bad and the presence of pleasure is good, the absence of pain is always good, even if no one exists to experience it. Meanwhile, the absence of pleasure is not bad because there is no one there to miss it. In his words, bringing someone into existence causes harm, while failing to bring someone into existence does not. This argument challenges the way we understand life itself. Where many see life as a gift, Benatar sees it as a burden filled with unavoidable suffering. Hunger, illness, loss, and the inevitability of death are all part of the human condition. While life does have joys, Benatar argues that they are temporary and often overshadowed by pain.
Ontological suffering. What happens when your sense of reality feels shaky? When the boundaries between yourself and the world blur, and even your very existence feels uncertain? This is called ontological insecurity, a concept introduced by psychiatrist R.D. Laing in his book The Divided Self. Ontological insecurity is not just a psychological state. It is a deep challenge to how we understand identity and existence. Laing described it as the feeling that one's sense of being is fragile or at risk of collapsing. For most people, life unfolds on a stable stage. We trust our sense of self, our relationships, and the world around us. But for someone experiencing ontological insecurity, that stage feels unstable. They may feel detached, questioning their perceptions, or even doubting the coherence of their own self. Laing identified three main fears that define this state. The first is engulfment, the fear of losing oneself in relationships or being consumed by the demands of others.
This often leads to avoiding intimacy in order to protect a fragile sense of identity. The second is implosion, a dread of being overwhelmed by inner chaos or by the vastness of existence itself. The third is petrification, the fear of being reduced to an object, stripped of humanity and personal agency. Ontological insecurity often shows up in conditions like schizophrenia or severe anxiety, where the boundaries between self and world dissolve. Lang saw it not simply as a disease, but as a response to living in a chaotic or isolating world. This idea echoes existentialist philosophy. For Sartre, the disorienting awareness of simply existing, what he called nausea, mirrors the destabilizing nature of ontological insecurity. Heidegger's concept of thrownness, being cast into a world beyond our control, captures our shared vulnerability. Lang believed that understanding ontological insecurity begins with empathy. It forces us to face the fragility of identity and to ask what truly holds us together when reality itself feels unstable.
Moral nihilism. Good, evil, right, wrong. What if these are not universal truths, but human inventions? What if they are simply stories we have created to impose order on a chaotic universe? This is the claim of moral nihilism, the belief that morality is not real, but a construct, a fiction we tell ourselves. J.L. Mackie, one of moral nihilism's main supporters, begins his book Ethics, Inventing Right and Wrong with the bold statement that there are no objective values. For Mackie, moral claims such as justice, kindness, or cruelty are not facts about the world. Instead, they are projections of human emotions and social conventions, as unreal as shadows cast on a wall. Mackie supported this view with two arguments. The first is the argument from relativity. Across cultures and throughout history, moral codes differ greatly. One society's virtue is another society's vice. If morality were truly objective, shouldn't we expect more consistency? Mackie suggests that these differences arise not from universal truths, but from human needs shaped by specific contexts. The second is the argument from queerness. If objective moral values really existed, they would be unlike anything else in the universe, strange metaphysical entities somehow guiding human behavior. But how could we ever detect such things? For Mackie, this idea is implausible, further weakening the claim of objective morality. However, moral nihilism does not necessarily demand chaos or lawlessness. Mackie described morality as a useful fiction. Rules like stealing is wrong are not cosmic truths, but practical tools that help societies remain stable. The fiction works even if it is not real. Cosmic horror. The universe is vast, indifferent, and impossible to fully understand. For every star we can see, countless others remain hidden, their light lost to the endless void. It is in this infinite silence that cosmic horror finds its home, an existential dread born from our smallness within a cosmos that neither knows nor cares about us. H.P. Lovecraft expressed this terror most clearly, writing that the oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. This is not the fear of monsters, but the fear that the world we know floats in a bottomless abyss, governed by forces beyond comprehension. Cosmic horror thrives on the idea that human intellect is inadequate to truly grasp the nature of existence. If the universe is indifferent, what happens to our ideas of morality or meaning? Cosmic horror does not give clear answers. It embraces this uncertainty, forcing us to confront truths that might shatter our understanding. It is like an ant crawling on a smartphone, aware only of the smooth surface, blind to the intricate systems hidden beneath.
Negative utilitarianism. Suffering is universal.
No matter who you are, pain cuts deeper than joy ever heals. Negative utilitarianism forces us to ask a difficult question. If ethics is meant to reduce suffering, should eliminating pain take priority over creating happiness? Philosopher Karl Popper explained this idea in his book, The Open Society and Its Enemies. He wrote that suffering evokes a direct moral demand for help, while there is no similar call to increase the happiness of someone who is already doing fine. For Popper, relieving suffering is not just important, it is morally urgent. Negative utilitarianism builds on classical utilitarianism, which aims to maximize well-being. But unlike traditional utilitarianism, it puts preventing harm above promoting happiness. The reasoning is simple. Suffering is heavier and more lasting than pleasure. While joy may brighten moments, pain, especially when it is intense or long-lasting, can dominate a person's entire life. Few people would choose constant agony in exchange for occasional happiness. This philosophy, however, leads to troubling implications. Critics point out that if the goal is to eliminate suffering entirely, the most efficient solution would be the end of all sentient life, because where there is no life, there is no pain. Philosopher David Pearce, a supporter of negative utilitarianism, suggests a less extreme approach. He envisions a future where science and technology can be used to eliminate suffering, creating a world in which pain itself no longer exists. Despite its stark conclusions, negative utilitarianism raises an urgent moral question in a world full of preventable suffering: hunger, disease, and war. Shouldn't reducing pain matter more than chasing happiness? Perhaps true morality lies not in how much joy we create, but in how much suffering we prevent. And maybe that is the part of life most in need of our attention.
Negative panpsychism. Panpsychism is the idea that consciousness is fundamental to reality, present even in the smallest particles. But negative panpsychism, a more recent twist proposed by philosopher Ricardo Zito, takes this idea in a darker direction. It suggests that while the building blocks of reality may allow for consciousness, most of them do not actually have subjective experience. In other words, consciousness might exist everywhere in potential, but in most of reality, it does not feel like anything at all. This challenges our natural belief that consciousness is always tied to inner experience. According to negative panpsychism, atoms, rocks, and trees may have the underlying properties needed for consciousness, but they lack the complexity to turn those properties into actual awareness. In this view, the brain does not create consciousness from nothing. Instead, it arranges existing structures in a way that finally allows awareness to happen. Consciousness, then, is not universal. It is rare, requiring very specific conditions of complexity and integration. This idea raises troubling questions. If consciousness is so rare, how did it appear at all? Is self-awareness nothing more than an accident, a brief anomaly in an otherwise unconscious and indifferent universe?
Determinism. Every choice you've ever made, what you ate for breakfast, the person you have become, might not have been a choice at all. Determinism argues that every action, every thought, and every event is the inevitable result of prior causes, which makes freedom itself an illusion. The idea goes back to ancient philosophy, but the 18th century mathematician Pierre-Simon Laplace captured its essence with his famous concept of Laplace's demon. This was a thought experiment about a hypothetical intelligence that, if it knew the exact position in motion of every particle in the universe, could predict the future with absolute certainty. For such an intellect, Laplace wrote, nothing would be uncertain. In the future, just like the past, would already be laid out clearly before its eyes. Determinism rests on the principle of cause and effect. From the smallest atomic movements to the firing of neurons in the brain, every action is tied to prior events. If time were rewound and played forward again, every thought,
every feeling and every action would unfold in the exact same way. This suggests that our choices were never truly under our control.
The myth of Sisyphus. What is the point of it all? Day after day you strive and struggle, only to wake up and face the same challenges again tomorrow. For Albert Camus, this endless repetition mirrors the story of Sisyphus, a man condemned by the gods to roll a boulder up a hill, only for it to tumble back down every time he nears the top. It is a story of futility, but Camus saw it as the perfect metaphor for the human condition. In his essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, Camus asks the ultimate question: is life worth living? If life has no inherent meaning, does that not make existence itself absurd? The absurd, Camus explains, arises from the clash between our desperate search for purpose and the universe's complete indifference to that search. Yet, instead of despair, Camus finds a strange kind of liberation. He writes, "The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart." Sisyphus, endlessly toiling without hope of success, appears to be trapped. But Camus reclaims his story by embracing the absurd. By acknowledging the meaninglessness of his task, Sisyphus transcends his punishment. The gods may control his fate, but not his defiance. One must imagine Sisyphus happy, Camus concludes, because in his rebellion he discovers freedom. Camus' philosophy is not about despair, it is about living fully despite life's absurdity. He rejects both nihilism and false hope, insisting that life's lack of inherent meaning actually increases its value. Each moment becomes an opportunity to create meaning, not because the universe requires it, but because we choose it. Like Sisyphus, we face our own endless cycles. But for Camus, it is not the task that defines us, it is our attitude toward the climb. And in the climb, we find our freedom.
Animal suffering in theodicy. If God is all good and all powerful, then why does innocent suffering exist, especially among animals who cannot commit moral failings? This question lies at the center of the problem of animal suffering in theodicy, and it has challenged both religious and philosophical thought. Animals have suffered for millions of years, through predation, disease, starvation, and natural disasters. Unlike humans, they cannot rationalize their pain or find meaning in it. If their suffering serves no greater purpose, why would a benevolent God allow it? Philosopher William Rowe illustrated this with his famous thought experiment of a fawn trapped in a forest fire, suffering immensely before dying alone. Rowe asked, what purpose could such suffering serve? If the answer is none, then it poses a serious challenge to the existence of an all-good God. Theists have offered different defenses to reconcile animal suffering with divine benevolence. The greater good defense argues that animal suffering plays a role in a larger divine plan, pain and predation balancing ecosystems and fostering complexity. Others invoke the free will defense, claiming that a world of unpredictability and natural processes is necessary for human freedom. But animals, who lack moral agency, complicate this explanation. John Hick proposed that suffering is essential for soul-making, shaping moral and spiritual growth. But what spiritual growth could exist for a gazelle devoured by a lion, or a bird tormented by parasites? Critics, like David Atfield, argue that such defenses fail, that animal suffering appears excessive, unnecessary, and beyond justification. Terror management theory. Every decision you make and every belief you hold might be shaped by one central fact, the fear of death. Terror management theory explores how awareness of our mortality influences our thoughts, behaviors, and even the structure of society itself. The theory was developed in the 1980s by psychologists Sheldon Solomon, Jeff Greenberg, and Tom Pazinski. It builds on the work of Ernest Becker, who, in The Denial of Death, argued that humans, unlike other creatures, are uniquely aware of their mortality. This awareness brings with it an overwhelming terror that could paralyze us. To cope, we create systems of meaning, religion, art, nationalism, culture that give life purpose and connect us to something greater than ourselves. These cultural worldviews act as shields, protecting us from the unsettling reality of impermanence. But this psychological defense has a cost. When our worldviews are threatened, our fear of death resurfaces. Research shows that subtle reminders of mortality, what psychologists call mortality salience, can profoundly affect behavior. People become more defensive of their cultural values, more resistant to opposing ideas, and even more hostile toward those who threaten their beliefs. In one study, participants reminded of death were more likely to support charismatic leaders, leaders who promised strength, security, and stability. The fear of death, then, does not just shape individuals, it shapes entire societies. Our monuments, traditions, and rituals are not just cultural artifacts. They are, in many ways, defenses against death's shadow, anchoring us to a sense of permanence in a fragile and temporary world.
Bundle theory of the self. Who are you, really? Is there a core you beneath your thoughts, emotions, and experiences? The philosopher David Hume argued that there is not. In his Treatise of Human Nature, Hume introduced the bundle theory of the self, a radical idea that challenges our everyday sense of identity. Hume claimed that when we look inward, we do not find a single, unchanging self. Instead, we find a constantly shifting stream of perceptions, sensations, thoughts, and emotions. He wrote, "When I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception. I never can catch myself at any time without a perception, and never can observe anything but the perception." According to Hume, the self is not a solid, unified entity. It is a bundle, a collection of experiences, loosely connected like beads on a string, except that there is no actual string. The self is nothing more than the sum of its parts, an illusion created by the mind's desire for continuity. Think of a movie reel. The frames blur together to create the illusion of motion. But if you pause it, you see the individual frames disconnected and separate. Hume suggested our sense of self works the same way. It is a mental construct, not a permanent truth. This challenges deep concepts like identity, responsibility, and morality. If there is no core self, then who is accountable for our actions? Critics like Immanuel Kant argued that organizing our perceptions must require a stable self. Others point to memory and narrative as the glue that holds our identity together. Yet modern neuroscience often supports Hume's view, showing the brain as a patchwork of systems working in parallel with no single central controller. The self, it seems, is not a fixed thing, but a process. And Hume's theory leaves us with a liberating thought. If we are simply a bundle of experiences, then we are free to grow and redefine ourselves with every passing moment. The problem of other minds. How do you know that anyone else is conscious, not just alive, but truly aware, thinking, feeling, and experiencing the world as you do? Your best friend, your family members, even strangers on the street, what if they are only mimicking human behavior without having any inner awareness at all? This is the problem of other minds, a haunting philosophical question with no final answer. The problem arises because of the subjective nature of consciousness. You know you are conscious because you experience your own thoughts and feelings directly. But when it comes to others, all you can do is observe their behavior. A smile might suggest happiness, tears might suggest sadness, but are these signs of genuine inner experience? Or just outward displays with no awareness behind them? How can you rule out the possibility that others are what philosophers call zombies, beings that act conscious but lack true awareness? René Descartes famously declared, "I think, therefore I am," proving his own consciousness, but he could not extend that certainty to others, leaving the existence of other minds an open question.
Modern neuroscience can map brain activity and link it to thoughts and emotions, but even this does not give access to another person's inner reality. We can measure the brain's workings, but not the subjective experience itself. Here is the unsettling twist. Just as you cannot prove that others are conscious, no one can prove that you are. From their perspective, you might be the one who is simply going through the motions without true awareness. This question shakes the foundation of morality, relationships, and empathy. Yet, despite the lack of proof, we live and act as if others are conscious, because the alternative would be unbearable, a world where your own mind is the only true reality.
Causa sui. What if something could create itself, exist without any external cause? This is causa sui, the idea of being one's own cause. It challenges logic itself, forcing us to rethink the very foundations of existence. The concept originates with Baruch Spinoza, who used it to describe God, or what he called substance. In Ethics, Spinoza wrote, "That thing is called free, which exists from the necessity of its own nature alone, and is determined to act by itself alone." For him, God or the universe is causa sui, self-caused, infinite, and dependent on nothing else. This defies ordinary causality. Everything we know relies on something else, a tree from a seed from another tree. But where does the chain begin? Spinoza's radical answer? It doesn't. Something exists that needs no cause, because it is the cause. The idea echoes in existential philosophy. Jean-Paul Sartre spoke of the human desire to be self-created, the project of being God. While humans cannot truly be causa sui, our struggle to define ourselves, free from external influence, shapes our very existence. Even science brushes against the idea. If everything has a cause, what caused the universe? Could it have created itself, or does it demand an external first cause? Spinoza insists, the universe requires no explanation. It simply is. Causa sui isn't about escaping causality, it's about confronting it. Can anything truly cause itself, or is it just our longing to break free from the web of causes that define us?
Being toward death. You are dying. Not someday far away, but right now. Each breath, each passing moment brings you closer to the end. This stark truth is the foundation of Martin Heidegger's concept of being toward death. For Heidegger, death is not just an event at the end of life, it is the defining feature of existence itself, shaping how we live every day. Death is paradoxical, absolutely certain, yet utterly unknowable. He wrote, "As soon as man comes to life, he is at once old enough to die." Death is always present, part of who we are, even though its timing remains hidden. Most of us avoid this reality, distracting ourselves with routines, roles, and social norms, what Heidegger calls the they-self. In this state, we live inauthentically, pretending death is distant. But to live authentically, he argues, we must face mortality head-on. To be toward death is to accept our finitude, to let it weigh on every choice. This awareness transforms life. Each moment becomes precious, each decision deliberate. Far from despair, it becomes freedom. Knowing that time is limited, we stop living for others and begin living for ourselves. Death, Heidegger reminds us, is the ultimate individual experience. No one can die your death for you. In confronting this truth, we discover life's deepest meaning, that impermanence is not a curse, but the very source of its value. Ironic process theory. Don't think of a white bear. Whatever you do, don't picture it.
Chances are, you just did. This paradox lies at the heart of ironic process theory, introduced by psychologist Daniel Wegner in the 1980s. The theory reveals a strange quirk of the mind. The more we try to suppress a thought, the more it forces its way back in. When we attempt thought suppression, the mind splits into two processes. The first tries to push the thought away. Don't think of the bear. But the second, running in the background, constantly checks whether the thought has reappeared. Ironically, that very monitoring keeps the idea alive. Wegner demonstrated this in experiments. Participants told not to think of a white bear ended up thinking of it more often than those given no instructions at all. The implications are everywhere. Insomniacs who try to suppress worries only stay awake longer. Dieters fixate on forbidden foods. Heartbreak lingers because the more we try to forget, the more present the memory becomes. Wegner suggested strategies: distraction, replacing the white bear with a black cat, or mindfulness, allowing thoughts to drift by without resistance, like clouds passing through the sky. The lesson is clear. Suppression fuels obsession. The harder we fight the thought, the stronger it becomes. Sometimes, the only way to let go is to stop trying.
Moral desert. Do we truly deserve anything? The idea of moral desert asks whether people genuinely earn the rewards and punishments they receive. At first glance, it seems obvious. Good actions deserve good outcomes, and bad actions deserve bad ones. But philosophers like John Rawls challenge this intuition. In A Theory of Justice, Rawls argued that much of what we deserve rests on luck. Our intelligence, our talents, and even our moral character, all are shaped by genetics, upbringing, and environment. If we didn't choose these foundations, how can we claim to deserve what flows from them? Consider two lives, one born into wealth and opportunity, another into poverty and hardship. Both may work hard, but their outcomes are radically different. Did one truly deserve success and the other failure? Or did luck set the stage before effort ever began? Bernard Williams went further, suggesting morality should focus not on desert, but on creating fair systems that reduce inequality. Too often, deservingness serves as a justification for injustice. Determinism deepens the problem. If every action is the inevitable result of prior causes, biology, environment, experience, how much control do we really have? And if free will is an illusion, can anyone be said to deserve anything at all? The stakes are real. Meritocracies claim to reward effort, yet effort itself is unequally distributed. Criminal justice punishes as though people chose freely, yet lives are shaped by forces beyond their control. Moral desert seems natural, but perhaps it is one of our most persistent illusions. The bicameral mind. What if human consciousness is far younger than we think? This is the startling claim of Julian Jaynes, who in 1976 proposed the theory of the bicameral mind. Jaynes argued that as recently as 3,000 years ago, humans were not conscious in the modern sense. Instead, their minds operated in two chambers. One hemisphere issued commands, and the other obeyed, interpreting those inner voices as the words of gods. He pointed to ancient texts like the Iliad, where characters rarely describe inner thought or reflection, but instead attribute decisions to divine commands. For Jaynes, these weren't poetic devices, but literal experiences of a divided mind. This bicameral mentality, he suggested, was adaptive, providing clear authority and guidance in chaotic early societies. But as civilization grew more complex and writing preserved knowledge, the system broke down. Pressured by wars, migrations, and social change, humans developed introspection and self-awareness, giving birth to modern consciousness. The theory is controversial. Neuroscientists question its biological plausibility, while historians criticize its reliance on selective textual interpretation. But its boldness lies in the question it forces. What if consciousness is not timeless, but a cultural and historical invention? If our self-awareness arose once, could it fade? Could a different future of humanity think without the inner voice we take for granted? James's bicameral mind leaves us with a haunting possibility that the self itself is not eternal, but fragile, a fleeting product of history. State of nature as war. Governments and societal rules are gone. What's left, according to philosopher Thomas Hobbes, is chaos, a brutal war of every man against every man. This is what he called the state of nature, a world without authority, which Hobbes saw as humanity's raw, unfiltered reality. In his 1651 book Leviathan, Hobbes argued that life in the state of nature would be ruled by fear and competition. Humans, driven by self-interest and survival, would constantly clash over resources and power. In such a condition, he wrote, the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Why would such chaos arise? Hobbes pointed to equality, not the noble kind, but the kind that makes everyone equally dangerous. Even the weakest person can harm the strongest through cunning or alliances, creating endless mistrust. Without rules or authority to ensure safety, people would live in constant suspicion, always ready to strike first. This wasn't just theory to Hobbes. He looked at civil wars and societal breakdowns as glimpses of the state of nature. Still, Hobbes didn't think humans were evil, only rational. In a world without order, survival demands preemptive conflict. He believed the only escape was the social contract, individuals giving up some freedom to a sovereign authority, the Leviathan, in exchange for security and peace. This authority, holding absolute power, keeps the chaos of the state of nature at bay. While critics argue that Hobbes underestimated human cooperation, his vision still resonates today. From political instability to international tensions, the shadow of the state of nature reminds us what is at stake. Hobbes challenges us to ask what truly holds civilization together and how far we are willing to go to preserve it. Panopticism. What if you were always being watched but never knew when? Would you act differently? This is the essence of panopticism, a concept from philosopher Michel Foucault in Discipline and Punish. It reveals how the possibility of being observed shapes behavior and extends control far beyond physical walls. Foucault was inspired by the Panopticon, a prison design by Jeremy Bentham. The design was circular, with cells surrounding a central watchtower. Guards could see prisoners without being seen themselves, creating a state of conscious and permanent visibility. The genius wasn't in constant observation, but in making prisoners believe they could be watched at any time. Foucault expanded this into a metaphor for modern power. Panopticism, he argued, isn't about actual surveillance, it's about the fear of it. The mere possibility of being watched makes people regulate themselves, turning surveillance into self-discipline. As Foucault wrote, real subjection is born mechanically from a fictitious relation. This principle runs through modern life: security cameras, workplace monitoring, and even social media. Do you post to express yourself or to shape how others see you? Panopticism shifts power from external enforcement to internal compliance. It also goes beyond technology. Schools, hospitals, and governments use observation and categorization to shape behavior. Foucault argued that modern societies moved from physical punishment to psychological control, subtle but effective. Panopticism raises critical questions. How much of our freedom is an illusion? Who is watching and why? Awareness of this dynamic gives us a chance to resist. The real power of panopticism isn't in being watched, it's in believing we are. And recognizing that belief is the first step toward reclaiming control. Fallenness of Dasein. We spend our lives scrolling, chasing fleeting pleasures, and following routines. But is this truly living? Martin Heidegger called this the fallenness of Dasein, revealing an unsettling truth about human existence. Much of what we do is simply a distraction from facing who we really are. In Being in Time, Heidegger introduced the concept of Dasein, meaning being there or existence. Dasein represents the human condition, our unique capacity to question life and seek meaning. Yet instead of confronting these deep questions, we fall into what Heidegger called fallenness, a passive absorption in the trivial and superficial. Fallenness isn't about morality, it's an existential state. Heidegger described it as being lost in the they, letting societal norms and expectations guide our lives. We conform to what they think, say, and do, losing touch with our authentic selves. We create perfect online personas, chase trends without questioning their value, and fill our days with distractions to avoid facing deeper truths. At its core, fallenness is a flight from anxiety. For Heidegger, anxiety isn't just fear. It's the unsettling awareness of our freedom to shape life without a predetermined purpose. This realization exposes the void at the heart of existence. Instead of embracing freedom, we retreat into routine and convention, avoiding the discomfort of authenticity. But paradoxically, anxiety can liberate us. Heidegger believed it could jolt us out of fallenness, forcing us to face our finitude and take responsibility for our choices. Authenticity lies not in rejecting society, but in consciously defining our own purpose.
Vanity of existence. Why do we strive and toil, knowing that nothing lasts? This is the heart of Arthur Schopenhauer's idea of the vanity of existence, a stark reflection on the futility of life. For Schopenhauer, existence is a relentless cycle of striving, suffering, and inevitable decline. He wrote that the vanity of existence is revealed in the very form life takes, in the infiniteness of time and space, contrasted with the finiteness of the individual. In both ways, we are fleeting beings, drifting in an infinite, uncaring cosmos. Schopenhauer argued that life is driven by the will to live, an endless force compelling us to survive, reproduce, and chase desires. Yet every desire fulfilled only makes way for new ones. All satisfaction, he declared, is only negative, just the removal of a desire and its pain. This endless yearning mirrors Sisyphus endlessly pushing his boulder uphill. In daily life, this truth becomes obvious. A new achievement, possession, or recognition brings a short moment of joy, but the feeling quickly dissolves, leaving us wanting again. Even acts of creation, love, or legacy, Schopenhauer saw as attempts to mask the void. Time erodes all achievements. Even the greatest empires crumble. What has been and is no more always seems better than what is now. Yet Schopenhauer didn't seek despair, but clarity. He believed that recognizing life's futility could free us from its grip. Art, philosophy, and especially music offered moments of liberation from endless striving. Apophatic theology. God can only be described by negating, not by affirming. This is the foundation of apophatic theology, or negative theology, which teaches that any attempt to describe God is flawed, not because such descriptions are false, but because human language is incapable of capturing the infinite and transcendent nature of the divine. The concept goes back to early Christian thinkers like Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, who wrote that the highest of all things is neither light nor darkness, neither truth nor falsehood. It is beyond all assertion and denial alike. To understand God, he argued, we must first unlearn everything we assume we know. Apophatic theology rejects positive statements such as God is good or God is loving. These phrases, it says, reduce God to human terms, confining the divine within our limited understanding. Instead, it focuses on what God is not finite, not material, not bound by time, not comprehensible. It is like staring at the sun. You cannot look directly at its brilliance, but you can perceive its effects. This approach feels unsettling because it strips away certainty. If God is unknowable, how do we pray, worship, or build faith? Apophatic theologians suggest that this mystery is the very point. By embracing what we cannot know, we approach a deeper and more reverent understanding of the divine. In contrast, cataphatic theology describes God through positive attributes, but apophatic theology insists such efforts are limiting. As the mystic Meister Eckhart said, God is greater than God.
The last man. Have you ever imagined what the end of humanity might look like? Not in chaos, but in comfort. A world where ambition, greatness, and meaning itself have disappeared. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Friedrich Nietzsche introduces the concept of the last man. This is not a vision of extinction, but of spiritual stagnation. The last man represents a society that values comfort and safety above all else, abandoning the pursuit of greatness. He trades the struggle for meaning for shallow pleasures, content in mediocrity. The last man says, we have invented happiness, but this happiness is hollow. It is a life without dreams, risks, or aspirations, a perpetual avoidance of discomfort. The last man asks no profound questions, seeks no higher purpose, and feels satisfied with mere existence, living without challenge or depth. In stark contrast, Nietzsche's Übermensch, or overman, embraces chaos and struggle, creating his own values and transcending mediocrity. Where the overman sees life as an opportunity for creativity and growth, the last man reduces it to survival and routine. Nietzsche's warning still resonates today. The obsession with comfort, the endless pursuit of distraction, and the fear of failure all reflect the retreat from meaning that he feared. The last man is not evil or malicious. He is simply tired. Tired of striving, tired of questioning, tired of enduring. He represents humanity's quiet decline into irrelevance, where mediocrity replaces ambition.
Master-slave dialectic. Every relationship, Hegel argued, is a struggle for recognition. This is the essence of the master-slave dialectic, one of George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel's most profound ideas from the phenomenology of spirit. It is not only about domination, but also about power, dependence, and the deep human need to be seen. Hegel begins with two individuals meeting. Both desire recognition, but for true selfhood to exist, each needs their existence acknowledged by the other. This creates conflict, a life and death struggle for recognition. The outcome is a hierarchy. One becomes the master, the other the slave. At first, the master seems victorious, commanding while the slave obeys. But Hegel uncovers a paradox. The master's power is hollow because it relies entirely on the recognition of the slave. True transformation, Hegel argued, comes through the slave's labor. By shaping the material world, the slave gains self-awareness and a deeper grasp of reality. As Hegel wrote, through work, the slave becomes conscious of what he truly is. This dialectic is not only about literal masters and slaves. It is a metaphor for power dynamics in all human relationships, from history's feudal systems to modern economic and social hierarchies. It is also deeply personal, appearing in the dynamics between employers and employees, parents and children, even lovers. Recognition, Hegel showed, is rarely equal. But his insight goes further. True recognition, he suggested, comes not from domination, but from mutual acknowledgement. It is a delicate balance where both individuals affirm each other as equals.
Philosophical pessimism. Life is suffering, and perhaps not worth living at all. This is the central idea of philosophical pessimism, the belief that existence itself is deeply flawed. Thinkers like Arthur Schopenhauer argued that life is not a gift, but an endless struggle, where brief moments of joy are overshadowed by pain, boredom, and meaninglessness. Often called the father of pessimism, Schopenhauer believed life is driven by what he called the will to live, a blind and restless force that pushes every living being to survive and reproduce. He believed this will is the true root of suffering. In his work, The World as Will and Representation, he wrote that life swings like a pendulum, moving back and forth between pain and boredom. Even when our desires are fulfilled, the satisfaction fades quickly, leaving us either chasing something new or trapped in emptiness. For Schopenhauer, suffering is not just common, it outweighs happiness by design. Pain, he said, is sharp and unavoidable, while joy is fleeting and dull. And in the end, death stands as the final stop to this endless cycle of struggle and disappointment.
The Gnostic Demiurge. What if the world you see, everything you believe is real, was not created by a benevolent God, but by a flawed and arrogant craftsman? In Gnostic philosophy, this being is the Demiurge, a lesser deity marked by ignorance and pride. Far from the all-good creator of many religions, the Gnostics saw the Demiurge as a blind builder who shaped the material world not out of perfection, but out of error. They believed this flawed creation was a prison designed to trap souls in suffering. The term demiurge comes from the Greek demiurgos, meaning craftsman. While Plato used it to describe a divine creator who organized chaos, the Gnostics reimagined the demiurge as a false god. In texts like the Apocryphon of John, the demiurge named Yaldabaoth is depicted as a monstrous figure, a cosmic accident declaring, "I am God and there is no other." But for the Gnostics, the true divine essence lies beyond this flawed world, in a realm of spiritual purity. Humanity, they believed, carries a divine spark, a fragment of the true God, trapped within the demiurge's creation. Salvation, they argued, does not come from obeying this false God or from trying to perfect life within his broken world. Instead, it comes through gnosis, spiritual awakening. By recognizing the cosmic illusion and reclaiming the divine spark, one can achieve liberation. The myth of the demiurge still resonates today. Philosophers like Arthur Schopenhauer and modern science fiction like The Matrix explore similar ideas of a flawed or controlled reality. The Gnostics leave us with a haunting challenge. If this world is an illusion, are we brave enough to confront it and seek what lies beyond? Transvaluation of values. What if the values you hold sacred, goodness, humility, selflessness, were not designed to uplift you, but to control you? Friedrich Nietzsche argued that this had already happened. He called for a transvaluation of values, a radical rethinking of morality. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra and the Antichrist, Nietzsche identified two moral systems, master morality and slave morality. Master morality, rooted in ancient aristocratic societies, celebrated strength, vitality, and achievement.
Good was synonymous with power, while bad was weakness. But history, he claimed, witnessed a dramatic inversion. The oppressed, whom Nietzsche called the slaves, overthrew their rulers by creating a new moral framework. Ambition, dominance, and self-assertion were rebranded as evil, while humility, meekness, and self-denial were elevated as good. Nietzsche called this reversal an act of resentment, a morality born of resentment. This, Nietzsche believed, suppressed human potential. Slave morality, institutionalized through Christianity and modern ethics, stifled humanity's creative and life-affirming instincts. Man would rather will nothingness than not will at all, he wrote, criticizing how guilt and submission replaced vitality and self-overcoming. Nietzsche's solution was the transvaluation of values, a complete redefinition of morality. He envisioned the Übermensch, the overman, as an individual who creates his own values free from inherited codes. This was not a call for cruelty or tyranny, but a rejection of morality that glorifies weakness over strength.
Will to power. What drives us? For Friedrich Nietzsche, the answer was primal, the will to power. Beneath every action, every ambition, and every desire lies this fundamental force, a drive not merely to survive, but to assert, to overcome, and to create. The will to power is not just about domination in a simple sense. It goes deeper than wealth or control. Nietzsche saw it as the very essence of life itself, a force pushing every living thing to grow, to expand, to reach mastery. As he wrote, and thus spoke Zarathustra, "Where I found the living, there I found the will to power." From plants stretching towards sunlight to humanity's greatest achievements, this drive animates existence. Unlike Darwin's survival of the fittest, Nietzsche's will to power is not static. Survival is just existing. The will to power is dynamic. It seeks to transcend limits, to impose meaning on chaos, to push boundaries. It fuels our creativity, ambition, and even conflict. This drive, Nietzsche believed, is the root of life's transformative energy. But it is not just external. It is also an internal struggle. Nietzsche saw self-mastery as the path to becoming the Übermensch. The overman transcends societal norms, creating his own values. In The Will to Power, Nietzsche wrote, "To impose upon becoming the character of being, that is the supreme will to power." Critics have misinterpreted this idea as justifying tyranny, but Nietzsche was not advocating selfishness. The will to power is not inherently good or evil. It is neutral, shaped by how we use it. In our ambitions, our challenges, and our creativity, the will to power is at work. For Nietzsche, life is not about discovering meaning, it is about creating it. That spark to push boundaries, that restless drive, that is the pulse of life itself.
Divine hiddenness. If God exists, why does the world feel so silent? Why do so many people seek divine presence and find only absence? These questions form the problem of divine hiddenness, a challenge to faith, belief, and the very nature of God. Philosopher John L. Schellenberg formalized this argument, asking, if a perfectly loving God exists, why wouldn't his presence be unmistakable? In Divine Hiddenness and Human Reason, he argued that a loving God would prevent reasonable non-belief, yet many sincere seekers of truth remain unconvinced. Is this silence evidence that God isn't there, or that God doesn't care? Some believers answer that divine hiddenness preserves human freedom. If God's existence were undeniable, belief might feel coerced, undermining genuine faith. But critics, including Schellenberg, counter that freedom and knowledge are not incompatible. Just as knowing a loved one exists does not remove the freedom to choose them, knowing God exists would not destroy free will, it would enrich it. Others suggest that hiddenness serves a purpose, fostering spiritual growth or testing faith. Yet for many, especially those whose doubts arise from honest seeking, these explanations feel insufficient. Divine hiddenness also intensifies the problem of evil. If suffering already challenges God's goodness, why would he remain silent during humanity's pain? Wouldn't clarity bring comfort or hope? This is not just an intellectual problem, it is deeply personal. For those struggling with unanswered prayers, the silence can feel like abandonment. Yet some interpret it as an invitation to question, to seek, and to grow.
Inherent meaninglessness. To be free means that we exist without any built-in purpose. There is no ultimate reason for why we are here, so we are left with the task of creating our own meaning. But facing this emptiness isn't easy. Camus called this struggle the absurd, the conflict between our deep need for meaning and the universe's complete indifference. In his story of Sisyphus, Camus compared life to a man endlessly pushing a boulder uphill, only for it to roll back down again. The effort is pointless, yet Sisyphus's defiance changes his suffering into a kind of freedom. Camus concluded that one must imagine Sisyphus happy. What does this mean for us? Inherent meaninglessness is not a flaw we need to fix, but a reality we must accept. Since there are no cosmic rules forcing a purpose on us, we are free to create our own. Every decision gains weight because we give it significance. Whether it is art, relationships, or moments of joy, these are not gifts handed to us by the universe. They are victories carved out of chaos. The emptiness does not trap us, it sets us free. In a meaningless world, our choices matter more than ever.
Ego death. Who are you really? You are not just your name, your job, or even your memories. If you strip those away, what remains? Ego death gives a haunting answer. It is the complete dissolving of the self, where the boundaries between you and the world disappear, leaving only pure existence. Ego death is central in mystical traditions, Eastern philosophies, and even modern psychology. In Buddhism, it aligns with anatta, the teaching of no self, which denies the idea of a permanent identity. In Hinduism, it is described as realizing that the individual self, jiva, is an illusion, revealing instead the oneness of Brahman. Both traditions see letting go of the ego as the path to enlightenment. Carl Jung also explored ego death through psychology, linking it to individuation, the process where the ego confronts the unconscious and lets go of illusions of separation. He described it as a confrontation with the deeper self, revealing something far greater than the individual. But ego death is not just theory. It is a powerful and often unsettling experience. Many people describe it as the complete loss of their I, whether through meditation, spiritual practice, or psychedelic journeys. Timothy Leary called it the total transcendence of the self, merging with the infinite. Why would anyone seek this? Because ego death breaks down the illusions we cling to, our separateness, our roles, our fears. What is left is a deep sense of unity with all things, a clarity that feels both freeing and life-changing. Yet the process is not easy. Letting go of the ego can feel like dying as the self resists its own undoing. But on the other side lies freedom, a release from desires and attachments. No self-doctrine. Who are you? You might answer with your name, your memories, or your sense of me. But what if that sense of self is only an illusion, a story created by your mind? This is the teaching of the no-self doctrine, a core idea in Buddhist philosophy. At the center of this doctrine is anatta, the denial of a permanent, unchanging self. The Buddha rejected the belief in a core you behind your thoughts and actions. Instead, he described existence as 5 constantly shifting parts: the body, sensations, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness. These parts create the appearance of a solid self, But in truth, there is no central piece holding them together. Imagine a river. From afar, it looks continuous, but up close, it is just water flowing and changing. The self, the Buddha taught, is the same, a never-ending process, not a fixed thing. This idea has deep consequences. If there is no permanent self, then what happens to identity, attachment, or suffering? Much of our pain comes from clinging to desires, to ego, to the illusion of permanence. Realizing anatta allows us to let go of this clinging and move toward liberation. Centuries later, philosopher David Hume echoed this view. He wrote that he could never catch himself without a perception and could never observe anything but those perceptions. Like the Buddha, Hume found no evidence of a fixed self, only fleeting impressions.
Solipsism. What if you are the only conscious being in existence? This is the unsettling idea of solipsism, the belief that nothing outside your own mind can be known to exist. The people you see, the world you live in, and even the entire universe could all be creations of your consciousness. And the disturbing part is that there is no way to prove otherwise. The roots of solipsism go back to ancient philosophy, but it became most famous through René Descartes in his Meditations on First Philosophy. Descartes doubted everything, his senses, his memories, and the physical world. The only certainty he found was his own mind, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. For Descartes, this was the foundation of knowledge. But solipsism goes further, refusing the external guarantees Descartes proposed, such as God confirming the world's reality. Solipsism claims that only your thoughts, perceptions, and consciousness are truly certain. Everything else is doubtful. The problem is both simple and profound. Every experience you have is filtered through your mind. How can you prove that the people you speak to are not just projections of your imagination? How can you be sure the world was not created only moments ago with false memories implanted to make it feel real? Philosophers like Ludwig Wittgenstein pushed back against solipsism, arguing that thought and language are shaped by interaction with others. Without a shared world, even the structure of thought itself would collapse.
Personal identity paradox. Who are you? Not just your name, your face, or even your memories. Who are you truly? The personal identity paradox forces us to question whether the self we cling to is really as stable as we believe. At its heart, the paradox asks, what makes you you? Is it your body, your memories, or your personality? Philosopher John Locke argued that personal identity is rooted in memory. If you remember being the child who rode a bike, or the teenager who graduated, that continuity defines who you are. But what happens when memory fails? Do forgotten moments stop being part of your identity? Critics like Thomas Reid pointed out that if identity depends only on memory, then a person could both be and not be the same individual, depending on which memories remain. Think of the ship of Theseus. If every plank of a ship is replaced, is it still the same ship? Now apply that to yourself. Your cells regenerate, your personality evolves, and your memories change. Are you the same person you were 10 years ago? Or even yesterday? Modern neuroscience complicates the issue even more. The brain is not static. It is a constantly changing network with no fixed self, but only a dynamic process. Philosopher Derek Parfit argued that identity itself is an illusion. Instead of worrying about being the same person, we should focus on psychological continuity, the fragile links between our past, present, and future selves.
Open individualism. What if you were not just yourself, but everyone? Not as a metaphor, but literally. Every life that has ever been lived and every life yet to come. What if they are all you?
This is the idea of open individualism, a bold theory proposed by philosopher Daniel Kolak. He argued that there is only one consciousness, shared by all beings. In his book, I Am You, Kolak suggested that individual identities are illusions, much like waves on the surface of an ocean. Beneath the surface, we are all part of the same vast, unified awareness. Most people believe in closed individualism, the idea that each person is separate, beginning at birth and ending at death. Open individualism challenges this view, comparing the self to walls in a house. The walls may divide space, but the air flows freely through it. In the same way, the separate selves we see are only temporary perspectives of the same universal consciousness. This idea is not entirely new. In Hinduism, Brahman represents the universal self, with each individual soul, Atman, inseparable from it. Buddhism's teaching of anatta also denies a permanent identity. Open individualism reframes these ancient insights in modern terms. But the implications are huge. If we are all one, does individuality really matter? Kolak argued that it actually increases responsibility. Harming another is harming yourself, while helping another is an act of self-directed compassion. Critics say the theory is unprovable, but Kolak counters that separateness is only a convincing illusion, like the moon, which seems to shine with its own light, but only reflects the sun.
Ego tunnel. What if everything you think you know about yourself is an illusion? Philosopher Thomas Metzinger, in his work The Ego Tunnel, challenges the assumption that the self is something real in the way we normally believe. Instead, he argues that your sense of you is a virtual construction created by your brain to help you navigate reality. Metzinger writes that no such thing as a self actually exists in the world. No one has ever truly been a self. The ego tunnel is his metaphor for how consciousness works. Imagine your mind as a tunnel through which you experience the world. Inside this tunnel, everything feels vivid and immediate. Colors, sounds, emotions. Yet what you are experiencing is not reality itself, but a simulation carefully crafted by your brain from limited information. Beyond the tunnel lies the raw, overwhelming complexity of the universe, something far beyond what your senses can ever take in. Why does your brain do this? For survival. The ego tunnel simplifies reality so that you can make quick decisions, build relationships, and find meaning. But in the process, it also creates the illusion that you are a unified, separate being moving through an objective world. This leads to profound questions. If the self is an illusion, do you really control your own actions? If reality is always filtered through a simulation, how can you ever be sure what is truly real? Metzinger suggests that by recognizing the ego tunnel for what it is, we can begin to reshape our sense of self and live more consciously.
Absolute loneliness. Loneliness is not just being without company. It is something much deeper, something absolute. Absolute loneliness is the realization that no one can ever fully know or experience your existence in the way that you do. No matter how many relationships you build or how deeply you connect, there will always be a permanent gap between your consciousness and the consciousness of others. Philosophers and existential thinkers have long wrestled with this truth. Jean-Paul Sartre argued that human beings live in a constant state of isolation, where even in the presence of others, we are fundamentally alone. The mind is like a private prison. Your thoughts, feelings, and inner world belong only to you and remain inaccessible to anyone else. Other people can observe you, speak to you, even love you, but they can never truly step inside your being. Neuroscience reinforces this idea. Every one of your experiences is locked inside the structure of your brain, filtered through your own perceptions, emotions, and memories. No one else will ever see the world in exactly the same way you do. Even language, our greatest tool for connection, is limited. Words can only approximate what we feel. They can never fully transmit the raw, unfiltered experience of being you. This realization can be unsettling. It means that even in a crowded room, where in moments of deep intimacy, there will always remain a part of you that is untouched, unseen, and unreachable.
Appearance versus reality. What if the world you see is not the world as it truly is? What if everything you experience, colors, sounds, even time itself, is only a carefully crafted illusion? The tension between appearance and reality is one of the deepest questions in philosophy, forcing us to consider the possibility that our senses deceive us. Plato illustrated this in his famous allegory of the cave. Prisoners, chained in darkness, see only shadows projected on a wall. Mistaking these shadows for reality, they never realize that the true world lies beyond. Plato believed most people live like those prisoners, confusing appearances for truth. For him, reality lies beyond the senses, in a timeless realm of eternal forms, accessible only through reason. Centuries later, René Descartes took this further in Meditations on First Philosophy. He doubted everything: his senses, his body, even the existence of the world itself. Could it all be an illusion, perhaps created by an evil demon? Through this radical doubt, he reached one certainty: cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. For Descartes, consciousness itself was the only undeniable reality. Modern science adds new layers. Quantum mechanics shows particles existing in multiple states until observed, while neuroscience demonstrates that perception is not direct but reconstructed by the brain. Colors are not inherent properties but interpretations. Even time, as Einstein revealed, is relative, shaped by gravity and motion. Yet despite all this, we trust our senses. We live by what we see and hear, even though illusions and now technologies like virtual reality blur the line between what is real and what is artificial. Philosophers like Kant remind us that we never access the world as it truly is. We only ever experience it as it appears to us.
Zeno's paradox. Imagine setting out to cross a room. It seems simple. You take one step, then another, and eventually reach the other side. But according to the ancient philosopher Zeno of Elea, you will never arrive. You are trapped in an infinite series of smaller and smaller steps, always moving forward, but never quite reaching your goal. This is Zeno's paradox of motion. He argued that before you can reach the other side, you must first reach the halfway point. Before reaching that, you must reach the halfway point to the halfway point, and so on, dividing the journey infinitely. If each step takes time, how can you ever finish an infinite series? Another of his paradoxes, Achilles and the tortoise, makes the puzzle clearer. Imagine Achilles, the fastest runner, gives a tortoise a head start. By the time Achilles reaches the tortoise's starting point, the tortoise has moved a little further. Each time Achilles catches up, the tortoise has advanced again. By this reasoning, Achilles can never overtake the tortoise, no matter how fast he runs. These paradoxes do not deny that motion happens. Instead, they expose a conflict between how we perceive motion and how mathematics once described it. The ancient Greeks were baffled by this, but centuries later, Newton and Leibniz, through calculus, showed that infinite sequences can still add up to a finite result. Achilles does overtake the tortoise, and you do cross the room, not because Zeno was wrong, but because he revealed the limits of early mathematical reasoning.
Zeno's puzzles endure because they push us to question infinity, continuity, and the nature of reality itself. The next time you take a step, consider this. Even the simplest motion hides infinite complexity, bridging the gap between logic and experience.
Infinite regress problem. What explains the universe? At first, the question sounds straightforward, but every answer only leads to another. Each explanation demands a further explanation, like pulling on a thread that never ends. This is the infinite regress problem, one of philosophy's most troubling dilemmas. Infinite regress appears whenever each explanation relies on something else, creating an endless chain of why. Aristotle recognized this in his Metaphysics. If every cause requires a prior cause, does the chain stretch back forever? To avoid this, he proposed a prime mover, an uncaused cause that set everything into motion. But is that a real solution, or simply a convenient stopping point? The problem appears everywhere. In morality, if actions are right because they follow rules, what justifies those rules? If rules rely on principles, what justifies the principles? The regress spirals endlessly, leaving no firm foundation. In knowledge, the issue is equally haunting. Every claim requires reasons, and those reasons need further justification. Philosopher Laurence Bonjour called this a vicious regress, one that makes certainty seem impossible. Different approaches attempt escape. Foundationalism argues that there are self-evident truths that need no further justification, as Descartes claimed with, "I think, therefore I am." Coherentism, on the other hand, suggests that beliefs support each other in a web-like structure, though critics see this as circular. Some thinkers like Paul Tillich went further and embraced infinite regress as unavoidable, suggesting that the search itself carries meaning.
Hyperbolic doubt. What can you know for certain? This question lies at the heart of hyperbolic doubt, a method of radical skepticism developed by René Descartes. It begins by doubting everything, your senses, your memories, even the very world around you. Descartes did not use this method to destroy reality, but to uncover one absolute truth. In Meditations on First Philosophy, he argued that to find certainty, you must throw out anything that could possibly be false. "I will regard as false anything that is not completely certain and indubitable," he wrote. He started by questioning the senses. Can you trust what you see or feel? A stick in water looks bent, and distant objects appear smaller. If senses deceive even once, how can they be trusted at all? Then he doubted his thoughts and memories. Could they be illusions like dreams? In dreams, we often feel certain, only to wake and realize we were mistaken. Finally, he proposed the evil demon hypothesis. What if a powerful deceiver controlled your perceptions, making everything you believe false? Even in this extreme doubt, Descartes found one undeniable truth. The very act of doubting proves that you exist. From this realization came his famous conclusion, cogito, ergo sum. I think, therefore I am.
Existential angst. Confront this question. You feel it, a hollow unease, a weight pressing down. This is existential angst, a discomfort not from fear of death, but from the sheer burden of life itself. Søren Kierkegaard, the father of existentialism, explored this in his concept of anxiety. For him, angst arises from the realization of our freedom, the ability to choose, define ourselves, and shape our future. But with that freedom comes a terrifying truth. There are no guarantees, no ultimate guide. Kierkegaard wrote that anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. This dizziness stems from possibility. Imagine standing on the edge of a cliff. Part of you fears falling, but another part recognizes that you could jump. That unsettling awareness that your choices are yours alone is the essence of existential angst. Jean-Paul Sartre expanded on this idea,
calling humans
metaphysical rebellion. What happens when someone refuses to accept the world, not just socially or politically, but at its core? This is metaphysical rebellion, a concept Albert Camus explores in The Rebel. It's not merely resistance to injustice, it's defiance against the absurdity of existence itself. Camus begins with a harsh truth. The human condition is absurd. We seek meaning in a universe that offers none. This clash between our longing for purpose and the cosmos's indifference is the absurd. Metaphysical rebellion arises when someone refuses to surrender to this reality. But rebellion isn't despair, it's an act of defiance. Camus writes, "I rebel, therefore we exist." Instead of succumbing to life's lack of inherent meaning, the rebel creates their own. It's a challenge to the universe, an assertion that life can still be lived with passion and authenticity. Consider Prometheus from Greek mythology. He defied the gods by stealing fire for humanity, not just rejecting authority, but challenging the foundations of existence itself. Similarly, the metaphysical rebel refuses to accept a world devoid of meaning, striving instead to create values in the face of absurdity. Yet Camus warns of rebellion's dangers. When rebellion turns dogmatic, it can lead to tyranny. Revolutions that sought liberation often imposed new forms of oppression. Camus urges rebels to embrace uncertainty, to reject absolute systems. For him, rebellion isn't a solution, but a way of being, a refusal to stop questioning. The only way to deal with an unfree world, he writes, is to become so absolutely free that your very existence is an act of rebellion. And in that defiance, we find freedom.
Aletheia and oblivion. What if the greatest truths aren't hidden, but forgotten? The ancient Greek concept of aletheia, truth as unconcealment, suggests that reality isn't something we create, but something we uncover. It's a process of peeling back the veils of oblivion to reveal what has been obscured. In Greek, aletheia means the state of not being hidden. For philosophers like Heidegger, truth isn't static or absolute, it's an ongoing revelation of essence. Its opposite is Lethe, oblivion, forgetfulness. In mythology, the river Lethe caused those who drank from it to forget everything. Oblivion here isn't just forgetting facts, it's losing touch with deeper realities, the dulling of existence by routine or distraction. Modern life, Heidegger argued, often traps us in Lethe. Technology, social norms, endless distractions bury truth beneath layers of convenience and noise. Truth becomes hidden not because it's complex, but because we stop seeking it. Consider a forest. To a hurried observer, it's just trees. But to someone who pauses and looks deeply, the forest unveils its richness, its intricate ecosystems, its quiet vitality. This is aletheia in action, the unforgotten truth emerging from oblivion. Yet unveiling truth is never complete. For every truth revealed, others remain hidden. Truth is a pursuit, a continual struggle against the pull of Lethe. As Heidegger wrote, to be is to stand in the clearing where beings reveal themselves.
the uncanny. Why do things that are almost human disturb us more than things that are not human at all? The answer lies in the uncanny, a concept exploring the unsettling tension between familiarity and alienation, when something feels close to home but isn't quite right. Sigmund Freud examined this in his 1919 essay Das Unheimliche, meaning the unhomelike. For Freud, the uncanny arises when the familiar becomes strange, provoking deep psychological unease. It's the lifelike doll, the too-real robot, or the shadow in the mirror that doesn't quite follow. These moments disrupt our sense of reality, exposing its fragility. Freud linked the uncanny to repressed fears and forgotten memories, calling it the return of the repressed. A human-like robot, for instance, might force us to confront the fragility of life and the blurred line between human and machine. Japanese roboticist Masahiro Mori expanded on this with his uncanny valley theory. He observed that as robots look more human, our affinity grows until they become almost human, but not quite. At this point, they evoke discomfort rather than empathy. Their near-human qualities feel disturbingly off. The uncanny has haunted art and storytelling for centuries, from the animated corpse in Frankenstein to the eerie twins in The Shining. It challenges the boundaries of identity and reality. It reminds us how much we rely on predictability, and when that's disrupted, it shakes our understanding of the world. Phenomenological reduction. Unfiltered experience remains at the center of phenomenological reduction, a method introduced by the philosopher Edmund Husserl to uncover the true nature of consciousness. Husserl believed that we often mistake our interpretations of the world for reality itself. Our minds are always coloring experiences with preconceived notions, cultural influences, and personal history. To see the world as it truly appears in consciousness, Husserl proposed a process called bracketing, or epoche, which means suspending all judgments and assumptions. This process begins with abandoning what Husserl called the natural attitude, our default belief in the external existence of the world. Instead, we focus purely on how the world presents itself in consciousness. Husserl wrote that we must free ourselves from the prejudice of assuming the world simply exists. This does not mean denying existence itself, but rather seeking to reveal how the world is experienced. Phenomenological reduction shifts attention from objects to the acts of consciousness that make them appear. For example, when you see a tree, you are not simply perceiving an object. You're experiencing sensory input, memory, and interpretation working together. Husserl's method uncovers these layers, showing how experience is shaped by the dynamic relationship between the observer and the observed. A central insight here is that consciousness is always intentional. It is never passive, but always directed towards something, whether perceiving, imagining, or feeling. By examining this relationship, phenomenology reveals the inner structures of experience. Although critics question whether we can truly set aside all biases, Husserl argued that striving for such clarity provides profound insights. His method influenced later thinkers such as Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty, who expanded on phenomenology's transformative potential.
Ding an sich. What is the true nature of reality? Do we see the world as it really is, or only as it appears to us? The philosopher Immanuel Kant addressed this question with the concept of the Ding an sich, the thing in itself. This idea challenges everything we think we know about existence. In his Critique of Pure Reason, Kant distinguished between the world as it appears to us and the world as it is in itself. According to him, we never experience reality directly. What we perceive, space, time, cause, and effect, is shaped by the structures of our own minds. These are not inherent properties of the external world, but frameworks our minds impose upon it. As Kant explained, we can never transcend the limits of our faculties to reach the thing in itself. The Ding an sich represents reality's true essence beyond human perception. Consider a tree. You see its shape, color, and texture, but these qualities are filtered through your senses. The tree's ultimate reality remains hidden. If we can never know the thing in itself, how can we claim to know anything? Kant argued that although we are limited to appearances, our shared cognitive framework creates consistency, allowing us to navigate the world effectively. Reality may be unknowable in its essence, but it remains coherent. This concept even resonates with modern science. In quantum mechanics, particles exist in undefined states until they are observed, echoing Kant's insight that ultimate reality eludes direct human experience. Inverted spectrum. What if the red you see looks completely different to someone else, but you could never realize it? This is the inverted spectrum, a thought experiment that questions our understanding of perception and the limits of human knowledge. The idea was first introduced by John Locke in his Essay Concerning Human Understanding in 1690. The inverted spectrum imagines two people who both call the sky blue and stop at a red light, yet what one person sees as blue might be what the other experiences as green. Their perceptions are inverted, but their behaviors are identical, making the difference impossible to detect. At its core, this highlights the problem of qualia, the raw, subjective experience of perception. When you see red, how can you ever know it is the same red that someone else sees? The inverted spectrum suggests you cannot, and you never will. Modern neuroscience shows that color perception is tied to wavelengths of light processed by the brain's visual cortex. Yet the brain does not simply record data, it actively constructs our experience of color. If these constructions vary between individuals, the differences remain locked inside each mind. This thought experiment extends beyond color. It touches on the hard problem of consciousness, described by David Chalmers. If subjective experience is inaccessible, how can we truly understand other minds? Could artificial intelligence, for example, perfectly simulate human behavior without ever possessing conscious experience? Could it have its own inverted spectrum hidden from us?
Moral luck. If morality depends on choice, how much control do we really have over being good or bad? What if the outcomes of our actions, shaped by forces beyond our control, define how we are judged? This is the unsettling concept of moral luck, introduced by philosopher Thomas Nagel, which questions the fairness of moral judgment. Nagel asks how much of morality is determined by luck. Even when we evaluate people's intentions, we often judge them based on consequences they could not fully control. Imagine two drivers texting while driving. One arrives home safely, while the other causes a fatal accident. Their actions were the same, but society condemns one as reckless while excusing the other. Is that fair? Moral luck appears in several forms. Resultant luck is based on outcomes, as in the driver example. Circumstantial luck depends on the situations people face, such as someone never being morally tested versus someone forced into a difficult choice. Constitutive luck refers to the traits we are born with, like courage or impulsiveness. Are we responsible for qualities shaped by genetics and upbringing? This concept raises deep questions. If so much of morality depends on factors outside our control, can anyone truly deserve blame or praise? Critics argue that moral luck undermines accountability, but Nagel suggests it reveals the complexity of moral judgment. He wrote that wherever there is moral judgment, there is a tension between what lies within our control and what does not. Veil of ignorance. If you had to design a society without knowing your place in it, what rules would you choose? This is the veil of ignorance, a thought experiment introduced by philosopher John Rawls in A Theory of Justice. It is a radical framework for fairness, forcing us to imagine justice without bias or privilege. Rawls asks us to picture the original position, a hypothetical scenario in which we design society's rules while standing behind the veil of ignorance. The catch is that you do not know your gender, race, class, abilities, or wealth. You could be born into any role, either as a billionaire or as someone living in poverty. Because of this uncertainty, Rawls argued, we would design a fundamentally fair society. We would avoid rules that favor any one group, since we would not know if we ourselves might end up in it. From this position, Rawls proposed two principles of justice. First, everyone should have equal access to the broadest possible basic rights and freedoms, such as freedom of speech and thought. Second, social and economic inequalities are only acceptable if they benefit the least advantaged members of society. This second principle, known as the difference principle, ensures protection for the vulnerable. The veil of ignorance strips away personal bias. It is not based on altruism, but on rational self-interest under uncertainty. If you could be born into any position, you would want a world where every position offers dignity and opportunity. Critics argue that Rawls' model is too idealistic or that it imposes redistributive justice at the cost of liberty. Yet his thought experiment challenges us to question existing systems. If you did not know your place in society, would it still feel fair? The veil of ignorance is not only a tool for imagining fairness, it is a vision of how justice itself could be built.
Moral non-cognitivism. When you say stealing is wrong, are you stating a fact or simply expressing how you feel? Moral non-cognitivism challenges the way we think about morality, claiming that moral statements do not describe objective truths, but instead express emotions, attitudes, or commands. One key branch, emotivism, was supported by philosopher A.J. Ayer. He argued that moral statements are emotional expressions. Saying, stealing is wrong, is like saying, boo to stealing. Likewise, saying, helping others is good, translates to, yay for helping. In Language, Truth, and Logic, Ayer explained that moral claims show feelings but do not state facts. Another branch, prescriptivism, was advanced by R.M. Hare. He argued that moral statements are not just emotional outbursts, but also commands. Saying, you should help others, is not describing a truth, but prescribing behavior, telling others what they ought to do. If moral statements are neither true nor false, how can we debate morality? Non-cognitivists argue that moral debates are not about presenting evidence, but about persuasion. When you say, stealing is wrong, you are trying to influence someone's attitude or behavior, not pointing to an objective fact. Critics worry this makes morality subjective and arbitrary. But non-cognitivists counter that morality has always been rooted in human emotions and shared experiences, not in universal truths. Moral statements, they argue, function to connect us, guide behavior, and promote social cohesion. For example, when you say, littering is wrong, you are not stating a cosmic fact. You are expressing disapproval and encouraging others to act differently.
Mackey's error theory. We often think of morality as something universal, objective, and eternal. But what if that belief is actually a mistake? J.L. Mackey's error theory makes exactly this claim. He argued that our moral judgments are built on an illusion. In his book Ethics, Inventing Right and Wrong, Mackey boldly stated that there are no objective moral values. When we say murder is wrong or kindness is good, we are not describing facts about the world. Instead, we are projecting our emotions, preferences, and cultural norms onto reality. Morality feels objective, but for Mackey, this is a shared human error. He defended this view with two main arguments. First is the argument from relativity. Moral beliefs vary greatly across cultures and throughout history. What one society condemns, another might celebrate. This moral diversity suggests that values are not universal, but are instead constructed by societies to serve their needs. Second is the argument from queerness. If objective moral facts did exist, they would be unlike anything else in the universe. Strange, inexplicable entities. How would we even perceive them? Mackey argued it is far more plausible to see morality as arising from human emotions and social agreements than from mysterious metaphysical truths. But Mackey did not reject morality itself. He acknowledged that moral feelings and moral language are very real. What he denied was their claim to universal truth. For him, moral values are human creations, not eternal laws. For example, saying kindness is good is not stating an absolute fact, but expressing a value that humans have embraced because it promotes cooperation and harmony.
The Euthyphro dilemma. Is something good because God commands it, or does God command it because it is good? This is the Euthyphro dilemma, a 2,000-year-old question that challenges the foundation of morality.
Plato first introduced this dilemma in his dialogue Euthyphro, where Socrates asks whether the pious is loved by the gods because it is pious, or whether it is pious because it is loved by the gods. This deceptively simple question divides morality into two unsettling possibilities. The first option is that something is good simply because God commands it. If this is true, then morality is arbitrary. If God had commanded hatred instead of kindness, would hatred then be good? This view reduces morality to divine whim, stripping it of intrinsic value. The second option is that God commands something because it is already good. In this case, morality has intrinsic worth independent of God. But this would mean that moral truths exist outside of divine authority, making God unnecessary for morality and undermining the idea of God as the ultimate source of goodness. The Euthyphro dilemma therefore creates a paradox. Either morality is arbitrary, dictated only by divine command, or it exists independently of God, which diminishes roles of God. Some theists have proposed a third solution, claiming that morality flows from God's very nature, which is inherently good. Yet critics argue this simply pushes the problem back one step because God's nature still arbitrarily defines morality. Philosophers such as Immanuel Kant avoided this trap by grounding morality in human reason rather than divine will. Secular thinkers take another path, arguing that morality arises from empathy, cooperation, and shared human values, making divine authority unnecessary.
Christian mortalism. Most people assume that the soul is immortal, a central belief in mainstream Christianity. But what if this is wrong? Christian mortalism is a theological perspective that challenges the idea of inherent eternal life. It asserts instead that immortality is not a natural quality of the soul, but a gift given by God. According to Christian mortalism, humans are mortal beings, and death is the true end of consciousness, what some call soul sleep. Eternal life is not guaranteed, but depends on God's power to resurrect the dead. In this view, life after death is not an automatic continuation, but a divine act. This belief is not new. Theologians such as John Milton argued that the Bible emphasizes resurrection rather than innate immortality. In De Doctrina Christiana, Milton wrote that man is a living soul, not an immortal one. Christian mortalists also cite verses like Ecclesiastes 9:5, "The dead know nothing," and Romans 6:23, "The wages of sin is death," to support the claim that death is an unconscious state, awaiting judgment. Unlike traditional Christianity, Christian mortalism rejects the idea of immediate entry into heaven or hell. Instead, the dead rest until God determines their final fate, resurrection to eternal life or annihilation. This view challenges the traditional concept of eternal torment, presenting annihilation as the ultimate punishment for the unrighteous. Critics argue that this position diminishes the significance of the soul, but its supporters see it as a return to biblical teachings, free from philosophical influences such as Plato's ideas of immortality. For them, this perspective highlights God's grace and power, making resurrection the central act of salvation.
Hell as eternal punishment. How can an all-loving God also allow an eternal hell? The concept of hell as unending punishment has perplexed theologians for centuries. Is it an expression of justice or simply a relic of fear? Scriptures such as Matthew 25:46, "These will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life," shaped the traditional belief in eternal torment. For St. Augustine, infinite punishment reflected the infinite nature of God's justice. Sinning against an eternal being, he argued, deserved eternal consequences. Thomas Aquinas had a different view. He saw hell not as imposed cruelty, but as suffering that comes from separation from God, a state that is self-inflicted rather than directly inflicted. Yet critics question whether eternal punishment is fair when human sins are finite. Modern theologians, such as John Hick, argue that a truly benevolent God would eventually redeem all souls. For him, the idea of eternal hell is incompatible with divine love. Universalists agree, believing that ultimate salvation for all reflects God's mercy. Conditionalists take another approach, proposing annihilation, the total destruction of the soul, as a more just alternative to eternal suffering. Contemporary thinkers like C.S. Lewis reframed the concept of hell as a choice. In The Great Divorce, he wrote that the doors of hell are locked on the inside, suggesting that hell is not imposed by God, but chosen by humans through pride, despair, or rejection of grace. From this perspective, hell becomes a self-imposed exile rather than a punishment inflicted by divine wrath.
Eternal bondage in Maya. Our lives are spent chasing desires, convinced that real fulfillment lies just beyond the next achievement. But what if this endless striving is only an illusion? In Advaita Vedanta, this illusion is called Maya, the grand deception that keeps us bound to an eternal cycle of suffering. Maya, often translated as illusion, hides the truth of reality. According to Adi Shankaracharya, it creates the false belief that the material world is all there is, dividing self from other, and covering our true nature. Under Maya's influence, we begin to identify with our egos, our possessions, and our temporary desires, forgetting our infinite self. This illusion traps us in samsara, the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. We chase satisfaction in wealth, in status, or in pleasure, only to find they are temporary. As the Upanishads teach, that which is real does not change, and that which changes is not real. Maya offers no lasting fulfillment because it is, at its core, unreal. Shankaracharya explains that Maya is a projection of Brahman, the ultimate reality. Like a dream, it controls us until we awaken. Breaking free requires jhana, true knowledge, gained through introspection and spiritual discipline. The Bhagavad Gita echoes this when Krishna says that the wise see no separation between the self and the universe. Think of Maya as a mirage. It looks real from a distance, but when you get closer, the illusion disappears. In the same way, recognizing the self, Atman, as one with Brahman dissolves Maya's grip. This awakening reveals reality as infinite, eternal, and whole.
Radical freedom and responsibility. You are free, completely free. But that freedom comes with a heavy weight. The responsibility for everything you do, for everything you choose, and even for everything you fail to choose. This is radical freedom, a concept explored by Jean-Paul Sartre, and it is both liberating and terrifying. Sartre believed that humans are condemned to be free. Without a divine plan or a fixed essence, we create our purpose only through our choices. Man is nothing else but what he makes of himself, Sartre wrote. This means there is no fate or outside guide that dictates your path, only you. Radical freedom strips away excuses. Blaming fate, destiny, or circumstances is what Sartre called bad faith, a denial of freedom. Even in times of oppression, your response remains your choice. You are not only a passive victim, you are an active creator of meaning. Yet this freedom also brings anguish. It is the dizzying realization that every choice reflects your values and helps shape humanity. When you act, You are declaring, this is how life should be. It is like standing at the edge of a cliff. The fear lies in your own power to choose. Sartre declared that existence comes before essence. You exist first and only later define what that existence means. It is daunting, but it is also empowering. If you are stuck in a job or in a relationship, Sartre would say you are choosing to stay. Even silence in the face of injustice is still a choice to accept the status quo.
Thanatos versus Eros. At the core of human existence lies a battle between two opposing forces, Eros, the life drive, and Thanatos, the death drive. Freud introduced these ideas in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, suggesting that human behavior is shaped not only by the pursuit of pleasure, but also by a darker, self-destructive impulse. Eros represents life, love, creation, and preservation. It is the force behind relationships, creativity, and the continuation of life. Thanatos, in contrast, represents destruction, aggression, and the drive toward non-existence. Freud believed this constant tension between creation and destruction defines what it means to be human, pulling us between the complexity of life and the simplicity of lifeless matter. These forces are not just abstract ideas. They appear in our daily lives. Eros drives us to build, to love, and to create meaning, while Thanatos tempts us towards sabotage and chaos. Think of an artist who is consumed by self-doubt while creating a masterpiece, or civilizations that flourish yet still wage wars that risk their very survival. Eros and Thanatos exist in personal struggles as well as global conflicts. Critics have questioned the reality of a true death drive, suggesting it may simply be a misreading of frustration or anxiety. Yet the metaphor remains powerful, because it reflects our inner contradictions. Why do we destroy what we love? Why do we sabotage our own happiness? Freud's contemporary Carl Jung saw this struggle as essential to growth, a balance between opposing forces that drives transformation. Life, then, is not about overcoming the tension between Eros and Thanatos, but about living within it. In every act of creation lies the shadow of destruction, and in every ending lies the seed of renewal.
The bad infinite. Infinity is not always majestic. Sometimes it can be terrifying. This is the essence of the bad infinite, a concept introduced by the German philosopher Jürg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. While infinity often suggests limitless potential, Hegel warned of a darker version, an endless cycle of hollow repetition that traps rather than expands. Hegel distinguished between two kinds of infinity. The true infinity is dynamic and transformative. It grows, it transcends limits, and it evolves, like the expansion of knowledge or the unfolding of the universe itself. In contrast, the bad infinity is static and lifeless, an endless cycle that offers no real progress. Imagine a number line stretching infinitely in both directions. Though limitless, it is sterile, a repetition of the same thing forever. Or imagine climbing an endless staircase with no new floors, no horizons, just step after step repeating endlessly. That is the bad infinite, where infinity becomes stagnation. For Hegel, this was not just an abstract idea, it was a philosophical warning. He saw this flawed infinity in rigid systems, in unreachable ideals, or in obsessive pursuits, where progress turns into a cycle of frustration. Take the pursuit of perfection. If perfection itself is infinite, striving for it can trap us in endless dissatisfaction. Each success only pushes perfection further out of reach, creating a cycle with no resolution, a bad infinite. Hegel argued that infinity is not automatically good or bad. The difference lies in how we engage with it. The true infinity embraces limits as chances to transcend them, finding meaning in growth and motion. The bad infinity, however, traps us in monotony.
binding us to cycles that lead nowhere. His insight reminds us that not all infinities inspire, some entangle. True infinity is not endless repetition, it is purposeful transformation.
Mirror stage. The person you see in the mirror is not truly you. That reflection, familiar yet distant, is at the center of Jacques Lacan's idea of the mirror stage, a key concept in psychoanalysis. Lacan proposed that our sense of self begins with a kind of misrecognition, an illusion that shapes who we believe we are. Between 6 and 18 months of age, an infant recognizes its reflection in a mirror. Even though the child experiences its body as fragmented and uncoordinated, the mirror presents a unified, idealized image. The child identifies with this image, seeing it as me. But this unity is an illusion. Lacan argued that the image in the mirror is only a projection, not aligned with the child's lived, fragmented reality. This moment marks the birth of the I, when the child begins to see itself as a separate object from the world. Yet this sense of self is fundamentally alienating because the I is based on an external image, not on inner reality. From this point forward, identity is shaped by the constant tension between how we see ourselves and how we think others see us. Lacan's theory shows that our sense of self is rooted in misrecognition. The person we believe ourselves to be is not our authentic being, but a construct, a mask built from cultural expectations, the gaze of others, and our own fantasies. Even in adulthood, much of our identity is shaped by external forces, from the roles we take on to the goals we pursue.
Idle talk. Martin Heidegger's concept of idle talk describes shallow, repetitive communication that dominates daily life. Idle talk is not just harmless small talk, it disconnects us from authentic living and hides deeper truths. Idle talk happens when language becomes a cycle of unexamined repetition. Gossip, cliches, and empty affirmations are prime examples. In Being and Time, Heidegger described idle talk as speaking about something without real understanding. It creates the illusion of connection, but actually distances us from deeper engagement with the world. Think of a viral headline that is shared and endlessly debated. How many people truly understand the issue, and how many are just repeating opinions they have absorbed? Idle talk thrives on surface-level chatter, unconcerned with truth, keeping conversations alive without real substance. For Heidegger, this was not a trivial annoyance. It leads to fallenness, where we lose ourselves in the noise of society and abandon deeper existential questions. Instead of thinking critically, we adopt pre-packaged ideas and allow them to shape our view of the world. What makes idle talk so dangerous is its comfort. It offers belonging and participation in collective narratives, but it pulls us away from authenticity. We stop engaging with our own unique perspectives and begin to conform to shallow patterns of discourse. Heidegger did not condemn all communication. He believed language could either reveal or hide truth. But idle talk replaces reflection with noise, blinding us to life's deeper meaning.
The banality of evil. Evil does not always arrive with horns and fire. Sometimes it shows up quietly, in a gray suit, just doing a job. This is the essence of the banality of evil, a term coined by Hannah Arendt in her book Eichmann in Jerusalem. It challenges our assumptions about what evil looks like and how it operates. Arendt covered Adolf Eichmann's trial, one of the key architects of the Holocaust. To many, he appeared as a monster, but Arendt saw something unexpected. Eichmann was not fanatical or even particularly intelligent. He was ordinary. He followed orders, pushed papers, and avoided reflecting on the morality of his actions. Arendt called this the banality of evil. Eichmann's crimes were not fueled by deep hatred, but by thoughtlessness, by blind obedience to authority, and by a refusal to question the system he served. He committed atrocities with bureaucratic detachment, not with malice. The idea is terrifying because it shows that evil does not always require hatred. It thrives in systems that discourage independent thought. When people reduce themselves to just doing their job, unimaginable harm becomes possible. Arendt argued that Eichmann's greatest crime was his failure to think, to judge, and to take responsibility. As she wrote, most evil is done by people who never decide to be good or evil.
Profound boredom. Boredom is not just an annoyance. It can also be a revelation. This is the unsettling truth behind profound boredom, a concept explored by German philosopher Martin Heidegger. Unlike ordinary boredom, is not about a lack of entertainment, it is about the absence of meaning itself. Heidegger described profound boredom as a state where everything feels indifferent. The distractions of daily life, work, hobbies, relationships lose their grip. Time seems to stretch out endlessly, and life feels empty. But for Heidegger, this state is not merely depressing, it is transformative. In his 1929 lectures, Heidegger explained that profound boredom strips away the layers of routine and forces us to confront existence itself. He wrote that boredom brings about a peculiar state in which one is suspended in limbo, cast back upon oneself. Profound boredom reveals the fragility of the structures we depend on to give life meaning. It is like staring into a void, unsettling, but also an opportunity. When life's usual answers fail, we are left with the fundamental questions: why am I here? What is my purpose? These questions, usually buried beneath daily distractions, become impossible to ignore. Heidegger saw this confrontation with nothingness as both terrifying and necessary. It's a chance to redefine meaning, not as something given to us, but as something we create ourselves. In moments of profound boredom, when even passions feel hollow, we glimpse the limits of our constructed identities. This is the paradox. Profound boredom does not provide answers, it creates the space where answers can be found.
The antinomy of pure reason. The universe both has a beginning and does not have a beginning. This paradox lies at the heart of Immanuel Kant's antinomies of pure reason, introduced in his Critique of Pure Reason. Kant argued that when reason tries to solve ultimate questions, it produces contradictions, antinomies, where opposite statements both seem valid. These contradictions reveal the limits of human understanding and show the boundaries of what we can truly know. Kant's first antinomy explores whether the universe has a beginning in time. On one side, reason argues that the universe must have a beginning. If time stretches infinitely backward, the present moment could never arrive. But reason also argues that the universe cannot have a beginning, because if it did, it would need a cause, and that cause would require another, creating an infinite regress. Both arguments seem logical, but they cannot be reconciled. Kant explained that these contradictions arise because human reason applies its principles beyond the realm of actual experience. Concepts like space, time, and causality are not intrinsic features of the universe. They are frameworks our minds use to interpret it. Just as a fish shaped by its experience of water cannot imagine life outside of it, our minds, shaped by space and time, cannot comprehend realities beyond these limits. The antinomies do not solve ultimate questions. They simply reveal reason's boundaries. Kant argued that we may ask whether the universe is finite or infinite, but the answers lie beyond what our cognition can reach.
Epistemic injustice. What happens when someone is denied knowledge, not because of what they say, but because of who they are? This is the essence of epistemic injustice, a concept introduced by Miranda Fricker.
It describes how certain voices are dismissed or undervalued due to bias, prejudice, or systemic power imbalances. This is not just unfair, it violates their role as contributors to shared understanding. Frigger identifies two main forms. Testimonial injustice happens when someone's credibility is undermined because of stereotypes. For example, a woman in a male-dominated workplace may share an idea that is ignored until a man repeats it. The issue is not her knowledge, it is her identity being doubted. The second form, hermeneutical injustice, arises when society lacks the concepts to describe certain experiences. For example, before terms like sexual harassment were recognized, women could not effectively name or challenge their experiences. It was not a lack of intelligence, it was a lack of social frameworks. These injustices are systemic. They silence marginalized voices and reinforce existing power structures. Over time, they exclude whole groups from shaping knowledge and truth, which deepens inequality. Frigger writes that epistemic injustice, when done to someone as a knower, is both distinctive and destructive. It harms individuals, but it also harms society, narrowing the perspectives that are heard. To combat this, Frigger calls for epistemic virtue, listening without prejudice, recognizing our biases, and valuing diverse voices. It is not easy, but it is essential for building a just society.
Mimetic desire. What you think you desire isn't truly your own. This is the foundation of mimetic desire, a concept introduced by philosopher René Girard. He argued that human desires are not original but imitative. We want things not because of their intrinsic value, but because others desire them first. Girard described desire as triangular. The subject, you, the object, what you want, the model, the person whose desire you imitate. For example, a new gadget, promotion, or even a romantic partner may seem appealing because someone else values them first. Social media and advertising intensify this by showcasing lifestyles engineered to spark envy and imitation. Girard warned that mimetic desire inevitably breeds rivalry. People don't just compete for objects, they compete for the recognition and status tied to them. The object itself matters less than the validation it represents. As multiple people pursue the same thing, conflict escalates, creating what Girard called mimetic traps. This dynamic also fuels scapegoating. When social tensions rise, communities often displace conflict onto a scapegoat, an individual or group blamed and excluded to restore order. Girard saw this mechanism at the root of cultural myths and religious traditions. Mimetic desire thus explains not only personal dissatisfaction, but also collective violence.
The paradox of tragedy. Why do we seek out suffering in art? This is the paradox of tragedy. In life, we avoid pain, but in literature, theater, and film, we are drawn to it. Aristotle, in Poetics, argued that tragedy provides catharsis. By experiencing fear and pity in a safe, aesthetic context, we confront and purge emotions, leaving with relief and clarity. David Hume, however, found it puzzling. In Of Tragedy, he suggested we don't enjoy suffering itself, but rather the artistry that transforms it. A well-crafted tragedy turns grief into beauty, weaving meaning into pain. Friedrich Nietzsche, in The Birth of Tragedy, took a starker view. He saw tragedy as forcing us to face chaos, suffering, and death head-on. Yet through art, this confrontation becomes life-affirming. Tragedy teaches us to embrace existence, not despite suffering, but through it. Tragedy also forges empathy. Watching Oedipus, Hamlet, or a modern character suffer connects us to our own vulnerabilities and to each other. Tears shed for fictional lives reflect real human fragility. The paradox remains. Tragedy transforms pain into something meaningful, aesthetic, and even necessary.
It allows us to rehearse our deepest fears without being destroyed by them.
Acrasia. Why do we act against our better judgment? This enduring puzzle is called acrasia. Socrates denied its possibility, arguing that wrongdoing always comes from ignorance. If one truly knew the good, one would pursue it. Plato disagreed, describing in The Republic how the soul is divided into reason, spirit, and appetite. Acrasia occurs when appetite overpowers reason. Aristotle refined this further in the Nicomachean Ethics, distinguishing between the weak-willed, who give in to temptation but regret it, and the self-indulgent, who feel no inner conflict. True acrasia, he argued, lies in knowing what's right, yet failing to act accordingly. In modern psychology, acrasia maps onto the gap between intention and action. We know we should sleep, but we scroll our phones. We plan to diet, but indulge in sweets. It is a battle between short-term gratification and long-term goals, where emotion overrides logic. Acrasia endures because it reveals the fragility of human willpower. It shows that wisdom alone isn't enough. Action requires discipline, habit, and sometimes grace.
Meta-ontology. What does it mean to say something exists? This is the question of meta-ontology. While ontology studies categories of being, meta-ontology examines the frameworks we use to decide what counts as real. Philosopher W.V.O. Quine reshaped the discussion in his essay On What There Is. He argued that before asking, "Does X exist?" we must clarify the language and criteria behind the question. Using Pegasus, the mythical winged horse, he showed that Pegasus does not exist in reality, it exists conceptually, highlighting the need to distinguish between types of existence. Quine suggested a pragmatic approach. Something exists if it is indispensable to our best scientific theories. Electrons, for example, are accepted as real because they explain observable phenomena, even though we never directly see them. Philosopher Eli Hirsch introduced the idea of quantifier variance. Multiple frameworks of existence may be equally valid. One may admit abstract entities like numbers, another may deny them without either being more true. Meta-ontology thus reveals that existence is not a universal fact, but a product of our conceptual schemes. To ask what is real is also to ask by whose standards of reality.
The ethics of forgetting. Forgetting is not merely a lapse of memory. It is an ethical act that shapes identity and society. This is the core of the ethics of forgetting. Friedrich Nietzsche, in On the Genealogy of Morality, described forgetting as an active power. Without it, we would be crushed under the weight of every slight and betrayal. Forgetting allows healing, renewal, and the possibility of forgiveness. It is a tool for growth. But Paul Ricoeur warned of its dangers. In Memory, History, Forgetting, he argued that forgetting can also be abusive. It may silence victims, erase atrocities, or distort collective memory. A society that forgets too much risks repeating injustices. This ethical tension is visible in transitional justice. Should post-conflict societies preserve painful memories in detail or soften them for reconciliation? Truth and Reconciliation Commissions embody this struggle between remembrance and forgetting. On a personal level, too, forgetting is double-edged. To forget every wrong is naive. To remember every wound is paralyzing. The ethics of forgetting asks us to balance truth and mercy, justice and renewal.
The Ouroboros. A serpent devouring its own tail. The Ouroboros is one of humanity's oldest symbols, appearing in Egyptian, Greek, and alchemical traditions. It represents cycles of creation and destruction, beginnings and endings, folded into one. Philosophically, the Ouroboros embodies self-reference, a system that contains itself.
The Greeks linked it to the eternal return, the Stoics to cosmic cycles of fire and rebirth, ekpyrosis. In Hegel's dialectics, contradictions resolve into higher unities, perpetually renewing meaning, an Ouroboros of thought. In modern science, the Ouroboros connects the universe's largest and smallest scales, from galaxies to quarks, suggesting reality loops into itself. But the Ouroboros is also unsettling. Nietzsche's concept of eternal recurrence poses a stark question. If your life repeated endlessly, would you embrace it or despair? The Ouroboros remains a symbol of paradox, renewal within destruction, meaning within contradiction, infinity within closure.
The Flynn effect is a fascinating idea named after James Flynn, who discovered that IQ scores have been rising steadily over the last century. He noticed that on average, scores have gone up by about 3 points every decade. This means that someone with an average IQ in the 1930s would actually score far below today's average. But the increase isn't the same across all areas. It shows up most strongly in abstract reasoning and problem solving, not in things like general knowledge or arithmetic. Flynn argued that this trend cannot be explained by genetics, since it is happening far too quickly for evolution to account for. Instead, he believed it reflects changes in the environment. The 20th century brought major shifts toward abstract thinking in education, new types of jobs that required problem solving, and even the way we interact with technology, from video games to smartphones. These experiences trained our minds in the kinds of skills that IQ tests measure. But does this mean people today are truly smarter? Critics aren't so sure. Some say the rising scores may only show that people have become more familiar with the style of IQ tests, not that their thinking ability has really grown. Psychologist Ulrich Neisser pointed out that IQ tests mainly focus on certain skills like logic, patterns, and reasoning, while overlooking other important forms of intelligence such as creativity, emotional depth, or social awareness. There is also concern that this upward trend might be slowing down or even reversing. Recent research has shown that in some countries, IQ gains are stalling or declining. Possible reasons include rising inequality, failing education systems, and changes in lifestyle that no longer encourage the same kind of mental growth.
The omnipotence paradox. Can an all-powerful being create a rock so heavy that even they cannot lift it? This playful but serious question is known as the omnipotence paradox. It directly challenges the very idea of unlimited power. Omnipotence is usually understood as the ability to do absolutely anything. But this paradox shows a contradiction. If an all-powerful being can create such a rock, then they cannot lift it, which means they are not truly all-powerful. On the other hand, if they cannot create it, then their power is still limited. Either way, the idea of total power seems to collapse. Philosophers have wrestled with this puzzle for centuries. Medieval thinkers like Thomas Aquinas argued that omnipotence should not be understood as the ability to do what is logically impossible. In his Summa Theologica, Aquinas explained that contradictions like a square circle or an unliftable rock are meaningless ideas, and therefore not true limitations of power. For him, omnipotence means the ability to do all things that are possible and reasonable. The philosopher René Descartes, however, took a more radical view. He suggested that an all-powerful being might even go beyond logic itself. If God willed that 2 + 2 should equal 5, Descartes claimed, then it would simply be so. But this interpretation troubles many people, since it makes omnipotence seem incomprehensible, bending even the laws of reason itself. The paradox doesn't only concern theology. It also raises deeper questions. Is the idea of unlimited power even coherent? Could an all-powerful being create a world they cannot control? Could they end their own existence? These questions reveal the limits of our language and imagination when we try to grasp concepts beyond human understanding.
The genealogy of morals. Why do we call some things good and others evil? Are these eternal truths, or are they products of history? Friedrich Nietzsche explored these questions in his Genealogy of Morals, where he traced the roots of morality back to cultural struggles and shifts in power. He argued that morality is not timeless or divine, but rather something created and reshaped throughout history. Nietzsche identified two main types of morality: master morality and slave morality. Master morality grew out of ancient aristocratic societies, where the ruling class valued qualities like strength, power, vitality, and excellence. For them, good referred to traits they embodied, while bad meant weakness, mediocrity, or inferiority. Slave morality, on the other hand, arose from the resentment of the oppressed. Lacking power, they redefined morality to serve their needs. They labeled strength and dominance as evil, while elevating qualities like humility, obedience, and suffering as good. Nietzsche called this a revaluation of values, a reversal of the older aristocratic code. Christianity, he argued, embodied this morality, glorifying suffering and promising rewards to the meek. For Nietzsche, this moral shift was revolutionary at first, giving the powerless a way to challenge the powerful. But over time, he warned, slave morality began to hold back human potential. It promoted conformity and obedience over individuality and excellence. To move beyond this, Nietzsche introduced the idea of the Übermensch, the overman or superman. This figure represents someone who transcends inherited moral codes, who creates new values that affirm life, strength, and creativity. Nietzsche didn't dismiss compassion or kindness, but he urged us to question where our ideas of good and evil come from. Do they give us strength, or do they limit us? Do they help us grow, or do they hold us down?
The sublime. Imagine standing on the edge of a cliff, looking out at a raging storm over the ocean. You feel awe mixed with fear, an overwhelming sensation that is hard to put into words. This is the experience of the sublime, a concept that has fascinated philosophers and artists for centuries. It explores the deep emotions we feel when beauty and terror meet. The sublime is not the same as ordinary admiration or pleasure. It is about scale, intensity, and the overwhelming sense of forces greater than ourselves. In the 18th century, Edmund Burke described it in his philosophical inquiry as astonishment mixed with some degree of horror. For him, the sublime arose in the presence of things like vast landscapes, violent storms, infinite space, or even the inevitability of death. Immanuel Kant expanded on this idea in his Critique of Judgment. He argued that the sublime is not only about the outside world, it is also a mental experience. When we face the immensity of a star-filled sky or towering mountains, we feel our own smallness. Yet, at the same time, we recognize our inner ability to grasp and reflect on such vastness. This tension between our insignificance and our intellectual power is what defines the sublime. The sublime often appears where beauty and danger intersect. A calm lake may be beautiful, but a roaring waterfall with its deafening sound and dizzying drop becomes sublime. It is the thrill of standing near something that could destroy us, yet being moved by its grandeur. Artists and writers have long tried to capture this feeling. Romantic poets like Wordsworth and painters like Caspar David Friedrich filled their work with scenes of towering mountains, stormy seas, and endless skies, all meant to evoke the sublime. Even today, we feel it when looking at breathtaking images of distant galaxies, volcanic eruptions, or the raw force of hurricanes. The sublime challenges us to embrace the unknown and to find meaning in the balance between fear and wonder. It reminds us of both our smallness and our extraordinary ability to perceive the vastness of existence.
The paradox of hedonism. The more you chase happiness directly, the further it seems to slip away. This is known as the paradox of hedonism, the idea that pursuing happiness as an end goal often backfires. The harder we focus on achieving pleasure for its own sake, the less likely we are to truly feel it. Happiness, it turns out, cannot be forced. Instead, it usually arises as a byproduct of other pursuits. Philosopher Henry Sidgwick helped popularize this idea in his book Methods of Ethics. He argued that when the pursuit of pleasure becomes too dominant, it ends up defeating its own purpose. He explained that constantly fixating on happiness makes us overly aware of even the smallest discomforts, which in turn makes contentment harder to achieve. In contrast, happiness tends to thrive when we are absorbed in activities that go beyond ourselves. Modern psychology backs up this paradox. Research shows that people who dedicate themselves to meaningful goals, such as helping others, mastering a skill, or nurturing close relationships, report higher levels of happiness than those who simply chase pleasure for its own sake. John Stuart Mill echoed this point long before psychology confirmed it. He observed that the happiest people are those who keep their minds focused on something beyond their own happiness. Why does this paradox exist? It seems that happiness is closely tied to purpose and engagement. A life centered only on self-gratification often feels empty and unsatisfying, while striving for something greater than ourselves often leads to moments of unexpected joy. In this way, happiness is not captured by directly chasing it. It emerges when we lose ourselves in meaningful pursuits.
The emptiness doctrine. Nothing exists on its own. This is the core of the emptiness doctrine, one of the central ideas in Buddhist philosophy. Far from being nihilism, it offers a radical shift in how we understand existence. According to this view, nothing has an inherent independent nature. Everything arises through interdependence. In the 2nd century, the Indian philosopher Nagarjuna developed the concept of shunyata, or emptiness. He argued that all things, whether they are objects, ideas, or even the self, exist only because of causes, conditions, and relationships. Nothing stands alone. For example, consider a tree. At first glance, it looks solid and independent, but it depends on sunlight, water, soil, and air. Remove these conditions, and the tree cannot exist. As Nagarjuna wrote, there does not exist anything that is not dependent. Therefore, there does not exist anything that is not empty. But emptiness does not mean nothingness. Instead, it means that things lack a fixed, unchanging essence. Even the self is not independent. It is shaped by relationships, culture, environment, and countless other conditions. Without these, what remains? Understanding emptiness is important because, according to Nagarjuna, clinging to fixed identities and permanence leads to suffering. We hold on to things as if they will never change, but in a world of constant change, this attachment only creates fear, frustration, and disappointment. By recognizing the emptiness of all things, we can free ourselves from clinging and live more harmoniously with the impermanence of reality. The emptiness doctrine teaches us that reality is not made up of isolated, independent entities, but of infinite connections. At first, this idea can feel unsettling. Nothing, not even you, has a permanent, independent essence. But it can also be liberating. Once we see the interdependence of everything, our perspective shifts. Life becomes less about holding on and more about flowing with change.
The problem of hope. Hope is a double-edged sword. On one hand, it drives us to endure hardship and pushes us forward in the face of difficulty. On the other hand, it ties us to an uncertain future, leaving us open to disappointment. The problem of hope asks whether hope is truly a gift or a hidden burden. Friedrich Nietzsche was deeply critical of hope. In his book, Human, All Too Human, he even called it the most evil of evils. He drew on the myth of Pandora's box, where hope remained trapped alongside all of humanity's other sufferings. For Nietzsche, hope wasn't salvation. It was a cruel extension of pain, keeping people clinging to expectations that could never be fulfilled. But other philosophers saw hope differently. Gabriel Marcel described hope as an act of faith in the face of uncertainty. In Homo Viator, he portrayed hope as a form of resistance, not about expecting guaranteed outcomes, but about affirming meaning even in hopeless situations. For him, hope was not about illusions, but about refusing to surrender to despair. The double nature of hope lies in how we use it. Blind hope, disconnected from reality, can lead to endless longing and inevitable disappointment when dreams fail to come true. But the philosopher Ernst Bloch saw hope as essential for human progress. In his book, The Principle of Hope, he argued that real hope inspires action rather than passive waiting. It is not wishful thinking, it is a force for transformation and for building a better future.
Anthropic bias. Why does the universe seem so perfectly suited for life? Is it a cosmic coincidence, or do we only ask this question because we're here to ask it? This is the puzzle of anthropic bias, a concept that reshapes how we think about existence itself. Anthropic bias grows out of the anthropic principle, explored by thinkers like Brandon Carter and Nick Bostrom. It says that our observations about the universe are shaped by the fact that we exist to make them. A universe capable of supporting life is the only kind of universe we could ever observe, because if it didn't support life, we wouldn't be here to notice it. Imagine being in a room filled with air. You might think, how convenient, there's air here for me to breathe. But in reality, the only reason you're alive to think this is because the air was already there. The same applies to the universe. The fact that it appears fine-tuned for life is not surprising. It is a requirement for us to exist in the first place. The constants of the universe, like the speed of light or the strength of gravity, are so finely balanced that even the smallest changes would make life impossible. To some, this suggests a creator, or perhaps the existence of countless universes in a multiverse where only a few support life. But anthropic bias warns us to be cautious. We can only ever observe a universe that is compatible with life, just as fish cannot imagine a world without water. Nick Bostrom argued that anthropic reasoning helps explain why the universe appears so finely tuned, but it also shows the limits of our perspective. Our very existence shapes the way we see reality, and this bias challenges us to think carefully about what conclusions we draw.
The Grand Inquisitor. What if humanity does not truly want freedom, but instead longs for comfort, security, and the illusion of choice? This disturbing question lies at the heart of The Grand Inquisitor, a parable from Fyodor Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. It forces us to rethink what we believe about power, faith, and human nature. The story takes place in 16th century Spain, during the time of the Inquisition. Christ returns to earth, and the people immediately recognize him. They celebrate his compassion and rejoice in his presence. But the church, fearing that he will disrupt their authority, has him arrested. That night, the Grand Inquisitor visits Christ in his cell, not to worship him, but to accuse him. He tells Christ that he gave humanity a gift it cannot bear, the burden of freedom. You wanted to make them free, the Inquisitor says, but they are weak and afraid. He claims that people do not want the responsibility of choice because choice only brings fear and suffering. What they truly want, he argues, are leaders who will give them certainty, even if that means losing their liberty. According to the Inquisitor, the Church has done what Christ would not. It has taken away freedom in exchange for happiness.
We will feed them, he declares, but we will also enslave them. Christ listens silently to this long accusation, offering no defense. At the end, he simply kisses the Inquisitor and departs. The meaning of this gesture, whether it is forgiveness, rebuke, or understanding, is left unclear. The parable confronts the deep tension between freedom and security. Are we really capable of embracing free will, or do we instinctively give it up for comfort? Dostoevsky does not give us an answer, only the haunting question. When we are faced with the choice between freedom and ease, which one do we pick, and what does that choice say about us?
The illusion of free will. You believe that you are in control of your choices, what you eat, what you say, which path you follow. But what if this control is an illusion? What if free will, the very foundation of human decision-making, is only a story your brain tells you after the fact? The philosopher Baruch Spinoza compared humans to stones rolling downhill. Each stone might think it controls its own movement, but in truth, it is simply pushed by forces it cannot see. Quote, "Men think themselves free," he wrote, "because they are conscious of their actions but unaware of the causes." Centuries later, neuroscientist Benjamin Libet's experiments showed something surprising. The brain begins preparing for an action milliseconds before we consciously decide to act. For example, when you decide to pick up a glass of water, it feels like you made the choice, but your brain already prepared the action before you were aware of it. Modern thinkers like Sam Harris argue that every decision we make is the result of prior causes, our genetics, our environment, and countless unconscious processes beyond our control. Harris puts it this way: you can do what you decide to do, but you cannot decide what you will decide to do. Even the act of thinking about a choice is shaped by factors outside your awareness. Critics fear denying free will might undermine responsibility and morality. But Harris says it should not remove accountability, it should shift it. Instead of asking who is to blame, we should ask, why did this happen? What shaped this choice? And how can we prevent harm in the future?
The is-ought problem. What if everything you believe about morality is built on a leap of logic, from facts about the world to values about what should be done, that cannot be justified? This is the is-ought problem, a challenge to moral reasoning first introduced by philosopher David Hume in the 18th century. In his Treatise of Human Nature, Hume noticed that moral arguments often begin with descriptions of how the world is, facts and natural laws, and then suddenly jump to claims about how the world ought to be, what we should value or do. But this leap, he argued, is not logically justified. There is no clear connection between descriptive statements and prescriptive moral rules. For example, someone might say, humans evolved to compete for resources, so we ought to prioritize self-interest. The first part is factual, the second part is moral, but why should the fact that we evolved this way mean we should act that way? Hume warned that this logical gap allows hidden assumptions to slip in unnoticed. This raises the question, where do moral values come from if not from facts? Some argue morality is objective, like mathematical truths, while others see it as a human creation shaped by culture and emotion. The is-ought problem also sparks debates about whether science can guide morality. Thinkers like Sam Harris suggest that science can show us what promotes human well-being, and that this can form the basis of morality, but critics point out that even this assumes we already value well-being, something science itself cannot prove. For Hume, moral judgments ultimately come not from logic, but from feelings. As he wrote, "Reason is, and ought only to be, the slave of the passions." Repressive desublimation. What if the freedom you believe you are enjoying
is actually a kind of trap. This is the idea behind Herbert Marcuse's concept of repressive desublimation, introduced in his book One-Dimensional Man. It forces us to rethink the desires and choices we assume are liberating. Marcuse built on Freud's idea that primal desires, like sexuality and creativity, are repressed by society and transformed into sublimation, which fuels achievements like art and culture. But Marcuse argued that in modern industrial societies, repression does not disappear, it becomes more subtle. Consumer culture, he said, manipulates our desires, giving us the illusion of freedom while actually keeping us under control. This is what he called repressive desublimation. Desires are allowed to be expressed, but not for true liberation, rather to keep us satisfied and compliant. Think about consumerism. Our desire for individuality gets turned into buying products that supposedly define us. Criticism of society is absorbed into entertainment, turning even rebellion into a commodity. Rock and roll, once a symbol of resistance, eventually became commercialized, losing its power to challenge the system. By feeding us instant pleasures, the system keeps us from questioning where these desires come from in the first place. Are our pleasures truly ours, or were they designed to keep us in line? Critics argue that Marcuse underestimated human agency. But he was not denying our power. He was warning us to stay watchful. True freedom, he believed, does not come from indulging in prepackaged choices, but from questioning the very system that offers them.
The veil of Maya, the sky, the earth, even your own body might be nothing more than an illusion. This is the idea at the center of the veil of Maya, a teaching from Indian philosophy, especially from Advaita Vedanta. It says the material world we see is only a facade, covering the ultimate truth, which is Brahman, the infinite essence of existence. Maya, which in Sanskrit means illusion or magic, creates the sense of separation in a universe that is actually one and unified. Adi Shankaracharya, a great figure in Vedanta, explained it simply. Brahman alone is real, the world is an illusion, and the self is not different from Brahman. Maya traps us in the endless cycle of birth and death by making us believe we are small, separate individuals. Think of a dream. While you dream, everything feels real: joy, pain, fear. But when you wake up, you realize it was all in your mind. In the same way, the veil of Maya convinces us that our identity, our struggles, and our desires are real, even though they are only temporary and passing. Western philosophy reflects something similar. Arthur Schopenhauer, influenced by Vedanta, described life as an ongoing process of disillusionment. He compared it to a world ruled by blind desires that hide deeper truths. For him, art and ascetic living gave rare glimpses beyond the illusion. So how can we lift the veil? Vedanta points to paths like knowledge, called jnana yoga, and self-realization. It is about recognizing that your true essence is not your body or your mind, but the infinite consciousness behind them. This is not about rejecting life, but about seeing through it, experiencing it without clinging or attachment. When the veil is lifted, only unity remains, an indescribable truth where the one who sees, the thing seen, and the act of seeing all become one. The question remains, will you awaken from the illusion or remain entangled in the dream?
Paradox of choice. Imagine walking into an ice cream shop. You're craving something sweet and ready to indulge. But instead of the usual 5 or 6 flavors, you're faced with 50. Chocolate, vanilla, pistachio, salted caramel, mango sorbet, rocky road, and so many more. At first, the abundance feels exciting, but as you try to decide, you begin to feel overwhelmed. You start second-guessing yourself. What if you choose pistachio but miss out on salted caramel?
What if Rocky Road would have been the perfect choice? Suddenly, what should have been a simple, joyful decision becomes stressful and exhausting. This is the paradox of choice. The idea that while more options may seem better, they can actually make us less happy, more anxious, and less satisfied with the decisions we make. It challenges one of modern society's biggest assumptions, that freedom of choice is always good. The concept was popularized by psychologist Barry Schwartz, who argued that too many options can paralyze us. Faced with overwhelming choices, we often struggle to make a decision at all. Think of how many times you've spent ages scrolling through a streaming platform, unable to pick a movie, only to end up rewatching something familiar. The more options we have, the harder it is to decide, because each choice carries the fear of missing out on something better. But the paradox doesn't stop at indecision. It also affects how satisfied we feel after making a choice. Imagine you finally settle on salted caramel ice cream. It's delicious, but as you eat it, you can't help but wonder if pistachio might have been even better. That doubt eats away at your enjoyment. Psychologists call this post-decision regret, and it's one of the key ways the paradox of choice undermines our happiness. A big reason for this is opportunity cost. Every time we choose something, we're also choosing not to do something else. With only a few options, the cost of what we didn't choose feels small, but with dozens or hundreds of possibilities, the sense of loss grows. We become hyper-aware of all the alternatives we gave up, which makes it harder to enjoy the option we picked. Another factor is expectations. The more options we have, the higher our expectations rise. If there are just 3 flavors, you'll likely be happy with whichever you get. But with 50, you expect to find the perfect one. If salted caramel doesn't deliver perfection, you feel disappointed. Not because it wasn't good, but because it wasn't flawless. Interestingly, this paradox doesn't affect everyone the same way. Some people, known as maximizers, feel compelled to find the absolute best option in every situation. They'll read hundreds of reviews before buying a phone, or spend hours researching restaurants before deciding where to eat. While this thoroughness seems wise, it often leads to stress and dissatisfaction, because maximizers constantly worry they could have chosen better. Others, called satisficers, simply aim for good enough. They make decisions quickly and don't obsess over alternatives. As a result, they're often happier and more relaxed. In today's world, where we're bombarded with choices, what to eat, what to wear, what to watch, where to live, who to date, which career to pursue, the paradox of choice becomes especially relevant. On the surface, this abundance of options feels empowering, but in reality, it can lead to decision fatigue, a state where the mental effort of choosing leaves us drained and less capable of making good decisions. So, how do we navigate this paradox? One strategy is to embrace good enough. Instead of chasing the perfect option, we can learn to appreciate the choices we make and let go of the rest. Another approach is to set limits on how many options we consider. For example, instead of endlessly scrolling through streaming platforms, decide from the first 5 movies you see. Simplifying decisions reduces stress and increases satisfaction. The deeper lesson of the paradox of choice is that true happiness doesn't come from unlimited options. It comes from being present, content, and confident in the decisions we make. Freedom isn't about endless possibilities. It's about clarity, purpose, and the peace of choosing without regret. In the end, the paradox of choice isn't just about ice cream or movies. It's a reflection of how we navigate modern life. It challenges us to rethink what freedom and happiness really mean, and reminds us that sometimes less truly is more.